Welcome, wanderer of the night. Come rest here a while and let us step back, far back, into a world where winter meant something entirely different than it does now. A world where darkness stretched for months, where cold wasn't just uncomfortable, but a constant companion, and where sleep wasn't scheduled, but woven into the very fabric of survival. Tonight, we're traveling to a time when the Earth was younger, the ice was closer, and our ancestors lived in ways that might seem impossibly hard to us now. Yet in that hardship they found something we've perhaps forgotten, a kind of rest that moved with the seasons, a sleep that flowed with the rhythm of fire and darkness, a peace born not from comfort, but from acceptance. Before we begin this gentle passage through time, I have a small request. If you feel moved to join me on this journey, consider pressing the like button. It's a quiet way of letting me know you're here. The hype feature below helps these stories find others who might need them on restless nights. Subscribe if you'd like more of these wanderings through history's quieter corners. And perhaps leave a comment. Tell me where in the world you're listening from, what hour it is where you are. Some of you may be cradled in deep night, others watching dawn approach, and all of you are welcome here. Now let the lights fade low, perhaps turn on a soft fan for that gentle hum of white noise, and settle yourself comfortably. We're about to step into winter, not the winter you know, but one that existed 40,000 years ago when humans slept in caves and fire was the difference between life and the cold silence beyond. Imagine, if you will, a landscape stripped of everything familiar. No cities, no roads, no distant glow of streetlights to soften the darkness. Just endless white stretching to the horizon, broken only by the dark shapes of pine trees bent under snow, and the occasional rocky outcrop where limestone caves open like mouths in the hillside. This is Europe during the Upper Paleolithic, the Ice Age, when glaciers crept down from the north and the world held its breath through winters that lasted half the year. You are there now, not as a visitor, but as one who belongs to that time. You are human as anyone walking the earth today, with the same capacity for thought, for love, for wonder. But your world is smaller, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. Your home is a cave, not the romantic notion of a cave, but a real one, with uneven floors and smoke-blackened walls and the constant drip of moisture from the ceiling. Your family, your tribe, numbers perhaps 25 people. You know each one intimately, for your survival depends on them as surely as theirs depends on you. The first thing you notice always is the cold, not the cold of a modern winter morning when you step outside briefly before returning to warmth. This is different. This is cold that lives in your bones, that never quite leaves, even when you're pressed against the fire. It's cold that makes your breath visible even inside the cave, cold that turns your hair stiff with frost while you sleep, cold that cracks the skin of your hands until they bleed. You wake in darkness. You always wake in darkness during winter because the nights stretch long and the brief pale days hardly seem worth distinguishing from them. The fire has died down to embers. You can tell by the quality of darkness, by the sudden bite in the air that makes you pull the fur tighter around your shoulders. Someone's responsibility to tend it, to keep it alive through the night, but exhaustion claims everyone eventually. The embers glow faint red in the center of the cave, pulsing like a slow heartbeat, and you know that soon someone must rise and coax them back to flame. That someone is often you. Not because you're assigned this task, but because cold is an insistent companion, prodding you awake long before your body has truly rested. You shift beneath the layers of hide, reindeer, bison, bear, each one killed and carefully skinned and scraped and dried. The furs have stiffened overnight in the cold, and they crackle softly as you move. Your breath comes out in small clouds. Around you, others are curled into themselves, trying to hold on to sleep, trying to hold on to warmth. Rising is an act of will. The furs, for all their stiffness, trap a small pocket of warmth created by your own body through the night. To leave that cocoon is to step into an entirely different world. But the fire must be fed, so you push yourself up slowly, your muscles protesting, your joints creaking in ways that would concern you if you lived in gentler times. But everyone's joints creak here. Everyone's body shows the wear of this life, even the young ones. The floor of the cave is not smooth stone, but layers of organic matter built up over years. Old straw bedding, dried moss, scattered bones from countless meals, the dust of crushed ochre from when someone painted symbols on the wall. It's uneven and slightly soft in places, slightly hard in others. Your bare feet, toughened from a lifetime without shoes, still feel the cold of it seeping up through the layers. You step carefully, avoiding the sleeping forms of others, making your way toward the fire pit. The fire pit is the heart of everything. It's a shallow depression in the cave floor, ringed with stones that have been blackened by years of fire. Ash piles around it in soft grey drifts. The stones hold heat long after flames die down, and even now, touching them carefully, you can feel warmth still lingering from yesterday's fire. The embers glow deep within the ash, and your task now is to wake them without smothering them. You kneel, your joints cracking again in the silence, and carefully blow on the embers. The ash lifts slightly, swirling in the air, and the red glow brightens for a moment before fading again. You reach for the kindling, fine, dry materials collected endlessly during warmer months and hoarded like treasure. A handful of dried moss, its texture like old paper in your fingers. Tiny twigs, each one carefully gathered, carefully dried, carefully saved. You arrange them over the embers with the concentration of ritual, because this moment matters more than almost anything else in your day. Another breath, longer and steadier. The embers respond, their glow spreading, reaching toward the moss. A tiny curl of smoke rises, pale in the darkness. Then, like a small miracle repeated each morning, a flame appears. Just a flicker at first, uncertain, but you've done this thousands of times. You know how to feed it, how to encourage it, how to coax it into life. More twigs, slightly larger, a piece of dried bark. The flame grows, pushes back the darkness by inches, and warmth begins to radiate outward in a small sphere. The sound of the fire waking brings others gradually toward consciousness. You hear someone shift, hear the rustle of furs, a soft cough, the quiet murmur of a mother soothing a child back to sleep, but no one rises yet. The cold is too insistent, and the day that waits beyond the cave mouth offers little comfort. Better to lie still, to conserve energy, to let sleep claim you for as long as possible. You feed the fire larger pieces now, actual wood, precious wood, each piece chosen from the carefully rationed pile stacked against the cave wall. Wood is survival. Wood is warmth and cooked food and light against the long darkness, and protection against the things that move in the night beyond your shelter. In summer, gathering wood is simply another task. In winter, it becomes a constant anxiety. How much is left? How long until the snows melt enough to gather more? Every piece that burns is a small death of security. The fire established, you don't immediately return to your sleeping place. Instead, you remain kneeling near the flames, holding your hands toward the warmth, feeling sensation slowly return to your fingers. They're cracked and rough, these hands, scarred from a lifetime of working with stone and hide and wood. The cold makes the cracks deeper, and sometimes they bleed, leaving dark spots on the furs you handle. But this is normal. Everyone's hands look like this in winter. The light grows gradually, not from sunrise, that's still hours away, but from the fire's strengthening. Shapes emerge from darkness. The curve of the cave wall gleaming slightly with moisture, The huddled forms of sleepers, each one wrapped in whatever furs they possess, clustered together because shared warmth is the only defense against cold that never relents. The hanging bundles of dried meat, suspended from the ceiling where smoke preserves them and keeps them away from scavengers. The tools leaning against walls, spears with stone points, scrapers, the frame for stretching hides. You notice, as you always notice, that your breath still fogs the air, even this close to the fire. The cold is bigger than the warmth. The cold is the world, and the warmth is just a small defiance against it, a temporary pushing back that requires constant effort to maintain. This is perhaps the fundamental truth of winter in this time. You are always losing the battle against cold. You can only slow the losing, never truly win. Someone else rises now, an older man, his hair grey and wild, his body moving stiffly. He makes no greeting. Words are conserved like wood in winter, used only when necessary. He simply moves to the entrance of the cave where ice has formed overnight, breaking off pieces and bringing them back to the fire to melt for water. The ice cracks with sharp sounds that echo in the cave space, and several sleepers shift at the noise but don't wake. The water from melted ice is the only water available now. The streams are frozen solid, buried under snow. Even getting ice means venturing to the cave mouth, means exposing yourself briefly to the world outside, where wind cuts like stone blades, and cold is so intense it makes your lungs ache. You watch him work, see his breath in great clouds, see him hurry back to the fire's circle of warmth with his gathered ice. The ice melts slowly in a hollowed stone placed near the fire, and while you wait, you begin the other morning tasks. The furs need shaking out, need checking for ice formation along their edges. The sleeping area needs tidying, bones from yesterday's meal removed, the layered bedding fluffed slightly to maintain some softness. It's repetitive work, the same each morning, and your hands move through it automatically while your mind drifts elsewhere. You think about food because you're always thinking about food in winter. The meat hanging overhead represents meals already counted, already allocated. There are calculations made constantly, unconsciously. How many days of food remain? How long until hunting becomes possible again? Whether the stores will last? The dried meat is tough, requires long chewing, and even then it's barely satisfying. The fat reserves ran out weeks ago. Now it's lean meat and whatever marrow can be extracted from split bones, and the hunger is a constant hollow companion. Breakfast, when it comes, is simple. A strip of dried meat, each warmed slightly by the fire, a shared drink of the melted water, passed around in a bowl made from a skull. Not human, some animal, but so old that no one remembers what kind. You chew slowly, making the meal last, knowing it's all you'll have until evening, unless the hunters find something, which in deep winter is unlikely. The snow is deep outside, the herds have moved to lower ground or further south. What remains are small, scarce creatures that require more energy to hunt than they provide in meat. The children are awake now, and they're hungry in ways that adults can suppress. They whine softly, and the mothers try to soothe them, but there's nothing to give. The youngest ones nurse still, but even that milk is thin now, the mothers themselves undernourished. Everyone is thin in winter, bodies consuming themselves slowly, waiting for the world to thaw. As the morning stretches on, though morning and afternoon are barely distinguishable in the cave's constant dim light, people settle into the rhythms of winter survival. There's no great activity, no bustling work. That's a summer luxury. Winter is about stillness, about conservation of energy, about keeping the fire alive and keeping yourselves alive and waiting for time to pass. Some work on tools, but slowly, methodically, making each movement count. A man sits by the fire, turning a piece of flint over and over, occasionally striking it with another stone, producing small flakes. He's making a blade, but he's been making this blade for days, and he'll continue for days more. There's no rush. Where would he use it? What urgent task awaits? The work itself is meditation, something to occupy the hands and mind. Women scrape at hides, though even this work is limited in winter. The hides are old ones being reworked, softened again, maintained. Fresh hides are summer work, when animals can be hunted regularly. Now it's about preservation, about keeping what you have functional. A woman uses a bone scraper, drawing it across the hide in long, patient strokes, removing whatever minute particles she can. Her hands move in rhythm, back and forth, and the sound is soft and repetitive, almost hypnotic. Children, when they have energy, play quietly near the fire. Their games are simple: arranging small stones, drawing patterns in the ash, whispering stories to each other. But even children are subdued in winter. The cold suppresses exuberance, they tire easily, and often you'll see them simply sitting, staring into the fire, their small faces serious beyond their years. The fire remains central to everything. It's tended constantly, fed carefully, never allowed to die. Someone is always watching it, always responsible for it, though the responsibility shifts informally throughout the day. When you tend the fire, you also tend the cave's heartbeat. You keep the darkness at bay. You keep the cold from becoming absolute. You maintain the one thing standing between the group and the vast, indifferent winter outside. Occasionally, someone must venture out to gather more wood from the stack outside the cave entrance, buried under snow but still accessible. To check the weather, to scan the white landscape for any sign of animal movement, to perform the necessary functions that bodies require. These excursions are brief, purposeful, and everyone hurries back to the fire's warmth as quickly as possible. The world outside is hostile in ways difficult to describe. It's not just cold, it's the negation of life. The wind doesn't blow so much as scour, carrying particles of ice that sting exposed skin. The landscape is monochrome, white and grey, with the occasional dark shape of a tree or rock breaking the monotony. The sky is usually heavy with clouds, low and grey and promising more snow. Sound travels strangely in this world, sometimes carrying impossibly far, sometimes swallowed entirely by the snow's muffling presence. And it's quiet. Deeply, profoundly quiet. The insects are gone, frozen or dormant. The birds have fled south. The herds have moved away. What remains are the scavengers and predators, wolves, cave bears, the great cats that sometimes prowl near human dwellings, drawn by the scent of stored meat. Their presence is felt more than seen, tracks in the snow, distant howls in the night, the occasional shadow glimpsed moving through the trees. This is why the cave is both shelter and prison. It protects, yes, but it also confines. You cannot simply leave and wander. You cannot explore. The world beyond is measured in survival calculations. How far to the wood supply? How far to check hunting grounds? How far before cold and exhaustion become dangerous? And always, always, you must return before darkness, because to be caught outside after nightfall in winter is to die. The day, such as it is, passes slowly. Time becomes elastic, meaningless, without clocks, without schedules, without the sun's clear passage to mark hours. One moment bleeds into the next. You might work on a task for what feels like a short while, only to realize hours have passed. Or you might sit for what seems an eternity, only to find the shadows have barely shifted. Conversation happens, but it's sparse, low. Stories are told, the old stories that everyone knows, repeated because they're comforting in their familiarity. Someone might recount a successful hunt from summer, describing the animal, the chase, the kill, the feast afterward. Everyone listens quietly, remembering what abundance felt like. Someone else might tell a teaching story about spirits or proper behavior, or the nature of things, and these stories carry more weight because they connect the people to something larger than their immediate suffering. But often there's simply silence. The crackling of fire, the occasional cough, the sound of someone shifting position, the drip of moisture from the cave ceiling, and beneath it all, the almost imperceptible sound of breathing, multiple bodies, all breathing in their own rhythms, creating a soft symphony of survival. Hunger grows as the day progresses. It's always there, but it becomes more insistent as hours pass. Your stomach feels hollow, your energy low, but there's nothing to be done. The stored meat is rationed carefully, and evening will come eventually, bringing with it the small meal that must sustain you through another long night. You notice, as everyone notices, that your body has adapted to this rhythm. You don't expect abundance, you don't expect comfort. You simply exist in this state of reduced life. Your metabolism slowed, your activity minimal, your body doing its best to survive on minimal input. It's not quite hibernation. You remain conscious, aware, active in small ways, but it's close. You're living at the edge of sleep, conserving everything you can. The cold is ever present. Even close to the fire, even wrapped in furs, there's a chill that never quite leaves. Your extremities are always cold, toes, fingers, the tip of your nose. You learn to ignore it, this constant discomfort, because acknowledging it serves no purpose. The cold simply is, like darkness or hunger, a fundamental condition of winter existence. As the day fades, though again the fading is subtle, just a gradual deepening of the already dim light, people begin preparing for evening. The fire is built up, more wood added than during the day, because night requires more light, more warmth, more psychological comfort. The evening meal is prepared, which means portioning out the dried meat, perhaps cracking open a bone to extract marrow, passing around the water bowl. You eat slowly, chewing each bite thoroughly, trying to extract every bit of nutrition, every moment of satisfaction. The meat is tough and lean and not particularly flavorful, but it's food, and food is life. Around you, others eat with the same focused attention. Even the children are quiet during meals, understanding at some level that this is serious, that this matters. After eating, there's a brief period of slightly more energy, slightly more conversation. Someone might work on a carving using bone or antler to create something beautiful for no practical reason except that humans need beauty even in hardship. Someone else might sing a low, rhythmic song without words, just sound, and others might join in, creating a harmony that fills the cave space and pushes back against the silence outside. But eventually, inevitably, exhaustion settles over everyone. It's not particularly late. There are no clocks to say so, but your body knows. It's time to sleep, time to surrender to the long night, time to conserve energy in the most complete way possible. The sleeping arrangement is communal. You don't each have separate spaces. Privacy is a luxury that doesn't exist here. Instead, everyone clusters together in the area closest to the fire, forming a mass of bodies and furs. You lie down in your spot, whoever's on one side of you today, whoever's on the other, and you pull the furs up over yourself and feel the warmth of other bodies nearby. This closeness is essential. A single person, alone with a fire, might not survive a winter night, but together bodies create a shared warmth that multiplies effectiveness. You can feel the person next to you breathing, feel their small movements, and it's comforting in a deep, animal way. You're not alone. The tribe sleeps together, breathes together, survives together. Someone is designated to watch the fire for the first part of the night, to keep it fed, to ensure it doesn't die completely. This person sits up, wrapped in furs, blinking slowly in the firelight, fighting their own exhaustion. Later, Another will take a turn and then perhaps another, though sometimes everyone simply sleeps and trusts that someone will wake if the cold grows too intense. As you lie there waiting for sleep, you listen to the sounds of the cave settling into night, the fire crackling and popping as wood burns, the soft breathing of sleepers, some already gone into deep rest, the occasional whimper of a child having a dream, the sound of wind outside, muffled by snow but still audible, a reminder of the world you've excluded by retreating here. Sleep, when it comes, doesn't come all at once. You drift into it gradually, falling into a doze, then waking briefly, then falling again. This is normal. The sleep of your time is not the consolidated 8 hours of modern expectation. Instead, it's segmented, flexible, responsive to needs. You sleep deeply when your body demands it, then wake partially to check the fire, to listen for danger, to adjust your position before sinking back into sleep again. The dreams that come are vivid, perhaps more vivid than they would be in gentler times. Your mind, freed from the constant attention to survival, wanders into strange territories. You dream of summer, of green grass and running water, and the taste of fresh berries. You dream of hunts, of the chase, of the moment of successful kill. You dream of people long dead, ancestors you've heard described but never knew, and they speak to you in languages you don't quite understand but somehow comprehend. Sometimes you dream of animals, and these dreams feel significant, charged with meaning. The animals in your dreams are not quite the animals you see when awake. They're larger, more powerful, more knowing. They look at you with intelligent eyes, and you wake with the sense that something important was communicated, even if you can't articulate what. The night stretches long. At some point, deep in the darkness, you wake fully for a moment. The fire has burned down but still glows. Around you, everyone sleeps, their breathing creating a rhythm like waves. It's very dark, very quiet, and for just this moment you're the only conscious being in the cave. You listen to the silence, feel the cold pressing at the edges of warmth, and you're aware of how precarious this all is, how thin the margin between life and freezing, how much you depend on fire, on shelter, on each other. But you don't dwell on fear. Fear serves no purpose here. Instead, you simply exist in the moment, breathing slowly, feeling your heartbeat, aware of being alive. Then exhaustion pulls you back down into sleep, and you go willingly, gratefully, into the warm darkness of unconsciousness. More dreams come, stranger ones. You're running through snow that never ends, chasing something or fleeing something, you're not sure which. You're in a cave that's not quite your cave, with people who are familiar but wrong somehow. You're standing on a vast plain under stars, so numerous they seem like snowfall, and you feel very small and very ancient at the same time. When you wake again, it's still dark, still night, but something has shifted. The quality of darkness feels different, thinner somehow. Dawn is approaching, though it won't arrive for perhaps another hour or more. The fire has died down to embers again, and you know the cycle is beginning once more. Soon someone will rise, will coax the fire back to life, will begin another day that looks identical to yesterday and will look identical to tomorrow. This is your life in winter. Not exciting, not varied, not filled with accomplishment or progress. Just surviving, just waiting. Just sleeping and waking and sleeping again, letting time pass, trusting that eventually, though that eventually feels impossibly distant, the world will warm, the snow will melt, and life will return to the frozen landscape. But in this moment, wrapped in furs, surrounded by sleeping tribe members, with the dying fire's glow painting the cave walls soft orange and red, there's a kind of peace. It's not happiness. Happiness is perhaps too active an emotion for this time, but it's acceptance. This is what life is. This is what humans do. They endure, they sleep, they wake, they tend the fire. And somehow, against all odds, they survive winter after winter, carrying forward into spring the stories and knowledge and resilience that will define your species for millennia to come. Let us shift now gently from the general to the particular. From the shared experience of winter survival to one life, one consciousness, moving through those endless, frozen months. We cannot know her true name. Names from 40,000 years ago are lost to silence, but for our purposes, let us call her Kora. She lived, if our calculations are correct, somewhere around 35,000 years before the Common Era, in what would one day be called southern France, near the limestone cliffs that hold caves decorated with paintings of animals that seem to breathe even now. Kora is 23 winters old, which makes her neither young nor old in her world. She has survived childhood, that dangerous passage when so many fall to illness or accident or simple ill fortune. She has borne 2 children, though only one still lives. A daughter of 5 winters who sleeps each night pressed against Kora's side. The other, a son, died in his 2nd winter from a sickness that made him burn with fever and gasp for breath. They buried him in the back of the cave, covering his small body with ochre and flowers that were already dried and brittle. Kora thinks of him sometimes, but grief here is different than it would be in gentler times. Grief is acknowledged, then set aside, because survival requires attention to the living. She is not tall by modern standards, perhaps 5 feet at most, but she is strong in the way that comes from constant use of the body. Her arms show defined muscle from scraping hides, from digging roots, from carrying her daughter and bundles of gathered goods. Her hands, as we've noted before, are roughened and scarred, but they're also skilled. These hands can identify plants by touch alone, can feel the quality of a hide and know exactly how much more scraping it needs, can thread sinew through a bone needle's eye, even in dim firelight. The bone needle is perhaps her most prized possession. It's a recent innovation, or at least recent in the slow time of prehistoric advancement. Someone somewhere figured out how to create a hole through bone without splitting it, and the knowledge spread gradually from group to group, carried by the occasional meetings between bands, by the rare marriages that brought individuals from one tribe to another. The needle has transformed clothing, making it possible to stitch furs tightly together, creating garments that fit the body rather than simply draping over it. This means warmth holds better, means survival becomes slightly less precarious. Kora's needle is made from the leg bone of a small bird, carefully shaped and polished until it's smooth and slender. The eye was painstakingly created using a stone awl, turned and turned until finally the hole broke through. She keeps it wrapped in soft leather, tucked into her personal bundle of possessions, a small collection of tools and materials that constitute everything she owns. The needle represents hours of careful work, and losing it would be a genuine catastrophe. With it, she can maintain the clothing that keeps her family alive. Without it, she would need to rely on others, and independence, even in a communal society, carries value. This particular winter began early, arriving with sudden snowstorms when the trees still held some color. The band was caught slightly unprepared, not catastrophically so, but enough that calculations became tighter, margins thinner. The hunting had been poor in the weeks leading up to winter's arrival, and the stored meat was less than ideal. Not desperately insufficient, but not comfortable either. Everyone felt the weight of that shortfall, the knowledge that this winter would require extra care, extra rationing, extra watchfulness. Kora, like the other women, took on the task of preparing the cave for the long confinement. They brought in armloads of dried grass to layer on the sleeping areas, carried stones to ring the fire pit more effectively, organized the hanging meat so it would smoke evenly, sorted through the gathered roots and nuts to remove any that showed signs of decay. This work was done methodically, carefully, with the understanding that small efforts now would compound into survival later. She also prepared her daughter, Lyra, for what was coming. The child had only experienced 2 winters before, and one of those she was too young to remember. Kora spoke to her quietly, explaining that they would be inside for a long time, that food would be scarce, that being still and quiet would become important. Lyra listened with the seriousness that children develop when they sense adult anxiety, and she nodded, her small face already learning to mask disappointment and want. The first weeks of winter were the hardest, as they always are. The body resists the change, wants to maintain summer's activity levels, summer's appetite. But gradually, over days and then weeks, a shift occurs. The metabolism slows. The mind becomes quieter. The constant low-level anxiety about food and cold transforms into acceptance, a kind of steady state that's sustainable if nothing disrupts it. Kora's days fell into rhythm. She woke when cold or discomfort made sleep impossible, usually when the fire had died down and the temperature in the cave dropped noticeably. She would lie still for a time, listening to determine if anyone else was awake, whether the fire needed tending, whether her daughter needed anything. Often, Lyra would still be deeply asleep, her small body warm against Kora's side, and Kora would simply lie there, letting her mind drift, not quite asleep, but not fully awake either. When she finally rose, the cold would hit immediately, making her breath catch. She would wrap a fur around her shoulders, a reindeer hide that she had personally scraped and softened, working on it for days until it was supple enough to drape comfortably and make her way to the fire. Sometimes she was first, sometimes others had already woken and begun the morning routine. It didn't particularly matter. The tasks were shared informally, everyone contributing according to energy and ability. She often took on the water gathering, breaking ice from the formations at the cave entrance and bringing it back to melt. This gave her a few moments outside, a brief exposure to the vast winter landscape, and while the cold was shocking, she found she needed these glimpses. To remain inside constantly felt suffocating, even though inside was survival and outside was danger. So she would step to the cave mouth, feel the wind cut across her face, see the endless white stretching away under grey skies, and breathe deeply before hurrying back to warmth. The morning meal was small, as all meals were in deep winter. Kora ate her portion slowly, focusing on each chew, trying to make her body believe it was receiving more than it actually was. Lyra ate quickly, her hunger less controllable, and then looked at her mother with eyes that asked for more. Kora would sometimes give her an extra small piece from her own portion, pretending she wasn't still hungry, because feeding her child felt more important than feeding herself. After eating, there was work, always work, though winter work was different from summer work. It was maintenance rather than creation, preservation rather than gathering. Kora would sit near the fire with the other women, and they would work on hides, scraping them again, even though they'd been scraped before, softening them with careful manipulation, checking for any weak spots that might split with use. The work was meditative, repetitive, and conversation would flow around it, quiet and desultory. They talked about food, always food, memories of summer abundance, descriptions of meals eaten in warmer times, discussions of what they would eat when hunting became possible again. They talked about the past, about people who had died, about other winters survived or not survived. They talked about the children, their small accomplishments and concerns. They talked about the men, their hunting attempts, their moods, the subtle dynamics of status and capability within the group. Sometimes they talked about the spirits, the unseen forces that moved through the world. The cave itself was considered a living thing in some sense, a being that sheltered them but demanded respect. Certain areas deeper in the darkness were not to be entered lightly. Sometimes strange sounds echoed from those depths, dripping water, wind whistling through hidden passages, or sounds that had no clear explanation. The women discussed these things in hushed tones, acknowledging mystery without trying to solve it. Kora was skilled at hide work, but her true talent lay in sewing. The bone needle had unlocked something in her, a precision and creativity that found outlet in the careful construction of garments. She could take separate pieces of hide and stitch them together so the seams were nearly invisible, so the resulting garment moved with the body rather than fighting it. Other women came to her when they needed something sewn, and she would help, not for payment. That concept didn't exist in quite that way, but because helping strengthened bonds, created networks of reciprocity that everyone depended on. She was working on a new garment for Lyra, piecing together rabbit hides to create a lighter layer that could be worn under heavier furs. Rabbit fur was soft and warm, and the small hides, while requiring more seams, created a flexible garment that a child could move in. She worked on this project in spare moments when her other obligations were met, and she took pleasure in the careful stitching, the way the pieces came together into something functional and protective. The days passed slowly, each one barely distinguishable from the last. Wake, tend fire, eat sparingly, work on small tasks, sit in silence or quiet conversation, eat sparingly again, sleep. The monotony was profound, but it was also somehow peaceful. There were no difficult decisions to make, no crises to navigate, just the simple rhythm of waiting for winter to pass. But one day, or perhaps one night, time blurred together. Something changed. The hunting party, which had been out for 2 days, checking distant valleys, returned early. Kora knew immediately that something was wrong. She could hear it in their voices, in the hurried way they entered the cave, in the tension that rippled through the group. The news was poor. They had found no game. The valleys were empty, the snow too deep, the cold too severe. What few tracks they'd seen were old, animals that had passed through days or weeks before, and worse, one of the hunters had injured his foot badly, falling into a hidden crevice. He could walk, but with pain and difficulty, and he would be unable to hunt for some time, perhaps for the rest of the winter. The band absorbed this news quietly. There was no panic, no dramatic reaction, but the atmosphere shifted. Everyone began calculating silently. The meat stores were perhaps sufficient for another moon cycle, maybe slightly more if rationing became stricter. The injured hunter would heal or he wouldn't, but either way, he couldn't contribute to acquiring food. The group's capability was reduced, and capability was survival. That night, the evening portion of meat was noticeably smaller. No announcement was made, but everyone understood. The rationing had tightened. Lyra ate her piece and looked at her mother with confusion. Why was there less? But Kora simply stroked her daughter's hair and told her gently that this was what they had, that she must be brave, that spring would come eventually. The nights became harder after that. Hunger, which had been a constant background companion, moved to the foreground. It became difficult to ignore, difficult to accept. Kora would lie wrapped in furs, feeling her stomach's emptiness, and sleep would come more slowly, more fitfully. She would drift into dreams where food appeared, summer berries, fresh meat, fish from the river, and wake to the disappointment of reality. The work during days became more difficult too, not because it was harder, but because energy was lower. Moving required effort. Thinking required effort. Everything took longer, required more rest afterward. The conversations among the women grew quieter, more sparse. Everyone was conserving, not just food, but energy, words, movement, everything. Kora noticed that Lyra was becoming quieter as well, less playful. The child would sit for long periods, simply staring into the fire, her small face serious. When she did play, it was with a listlessness that worried Kora. But what could be done? There was no more food to give. There was only waiting, only endurance, only the hope that the hunters would find something, anything, before the stores ran completely out. Then came the night when the fire went out completely. It wasn't anyone's fault exactly. The person watching had fallen asleep from exhaustion, and the fire, which had been burning low, simply consumed the last of its fuel and died. Kora woke to absolute darkness and a cold so intense it felt like a physical presence pressing down on her. She heard others waking too, heard the sound of confusion, of someone fumbling for kindling, of rising panic kept carefully under control. Rekindling a fire from nothing, in complete darkness, in severe cold, is nearly impossible. They needed embers, needed some spark still living. Someone found the fire pit by feel, dug through the ash desperately, searching for any remaining heat. And there, deep beneath the ash, a few coals still glowed faintly, barely alive. The relief was palpable, though no one spoke it aloud. They coaxed those coals carefully, tenderly, back to life, adding moss and twigs and breath, until finally flame returned. But in those minutes of darkness and cold, something had been understood viscerally by everyone in the cave. How close they were to the edge, how thin the margin, how easily everything could slip away. The fire burned brightly again, but the knowledge of its fragility remained. That night, no one truly slept deeply. People dozed in shifts, but always someone stayed awake, watching the fire with focused attention, feeding it regularly, ensuring the darkness wouldn't return. Kora lay with her daughter pressed tight against her, and she thought about the summer, about the warmth and abundance that seemed almost mythical now, impossible to believe had ever existed. She thought about death too, not with fear exactly, but with acknowledgement. People died in winters like this. Children, the elderly, sometimes even the strong, if fortune turned particularly cruel. It was simply a fact, not a moral failing or a tragedy beyond understanding, just part of how the world worked. But she thought about Lyra, about her daughter's small body, about how hunger made children vulnerable to illness, and she felt a fierce determination rise in her chest. Not her child, not this winter. Whatever it required, she would ensure Lyra survived. The following days were grim. The food portions shrank further. People moved less, spoke less, existed in a state of preservation. The injured hunter developed a fever, and the elder woman who tended to such things made poultices and gave him herbs, but everyone could see him weakening. His breathing grew labored, his eyes glazed. He died 3 days later, quietly, almost apologetically, slipping away in his sleep as though trying not to burden anyone further. They didn't bury him immediately. The ground outside was frozen solid, impossible to dig. Instead, they moved his body to the back of the cave, to the cold darkness there, and placed stones around him. They would bury him properly when the ground thawed, when ritual could be performed completely. For now, this would have to suffice. His death changed the calculations slightly. One fewer mouth to feed meant the stores would last longer. No one spoke this aloud. It felt wrong, mercenary, but everyone thought it. Survival required such calculations, and morality, when it came to survival, became complicated. Kora found herself sleeping more and more, not from choice, but because her body demanded it. She would wake to tend fire or eat the tiny portions allotted, but then Exhaustion would pull her back down. The sleep was deep and strange, filled with vivid dreams that felt more real than waking life. She dreamed of summer so intensely she could taste it. She was running through tall grass, her legs strong and tireless, chasing something, a deer maybe, or just running for the joy of movement. The sun was warm on her skin, gloriously warm, and she could hear birds singing and water flowing somewhere nearby. The grass smelled green and alive, and flowers, she couldn't name them, flowers that perhaps no longer existed, bloomed in impossible colors. She dreamed of her son, the one who died. He was healthy in the dream, laughing, playing with other children near the cave entrance. She watched him, feeling joy and grief mixed together, and when he looked at her, his eyes were knowing, ancient, as though he understood things she didn't. He smiled at her, and she woke with tears frozen at the corners of her eyes. She dreamed of animals, huge herds of them moving across plains that stretched forever. Mammoths with their curved tusks and shaggy fur, horses running in coordinated groups, bison so numerous they darkened the earth. The animals looked at her, really looked at her, and she felt they were trying to tell her something important, some message she needed to understand but couldn't quite grasp. One dream was particularly strange and stayed with her after waking. She was in a cave, but not her cave. The walls were covered with paintings, animals rendered in ochre and charcoal with such skill they seemed about to step off the stone. Horses mid-gallop, bison with lowered heads, predators crouching, and handprints, dozens of them, pressed against the wall in some pattern she felt should mean something. She stood in this dream cave, and she understood that people had been here before her, would be here after her, that the cave existed outside of time in some way. The paintings weren't just decoration, they were communication, message, prayer, connection to something larger than individual life. She reached out her own hand, placed it against the wall, and felt the stone cool and solid under her palm. Then she woke. The dream troubled her in ways she couldn't articulate. She thought about it through the day, and finally she mentioned it to one of the elder women, describing what she'd seen. The woman listened carefully, then nodded slowly. Dreams that came in winter, she said, were important. The spirits spoke more clearly when people were weak, when the boundary between this world and others grew thin. The dream was a message that Kora was connected to something ongoing, that her suffering had meaning beyond just personal endurance. This comforted Kora, not because she understood it fully, but because it placed her experience into a larger context. She wasn't just hungry and cold and waiting to die or survive. She was part of a pattern, a continuation, something that had been happening since humans first sought shelter and would continue long after she was gone. The winter stretched on, endless, monotonous grinding. But then, imperceptibly at first, things began to shift. The quality of light changed, not brighter exactly, but different. The days, which had been barely distinguishable from nights, started to show slight lengthening. Someone noticed that the icicles at the cave entrance were dripping slightly during what passed for midday. The cold, while still severe, felt less absolutely crushing. And then, one afternoon, the hunters returned with meat. A small deer, weak from winter but still viable, found and killed through patient stalking. The band gathered around the prize with something approaching joy, though joy was too strong, too energetic a word. Perhaps relief, perhaps gratitude. The deer was small, but it meant days of slightly larger portions, meant the stores would last until true spring, meant survival was now probable rather than merely possible. Kora received her share and ate it slowly, savoring every fiber, every drop of fat. She gave some to Lyra, watched her daughter eat with fierce concentration, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for weeks. they would make it. This winter, at least, they would survive. The meat brought energy back, slight but noticeable. People talked more, moved more, began to think about the future rather than just the present. Plans were discussed quietly. Where to hunt first when the snow melted, which valleys to check for early plant growth, how to repair tools and prepare for summer's work. Kora returned to her sewing with renewed focus. The garment for Lyra was nearly complete, and she worked on the final seams with care, making each stitch neat and tight. When she finished, she held it up to the firelight, examining her work. It was good, functional, well-made. She called Lyra over and helped her daughter into the new garment, adjusting the fit, checking the movement. Lyra smiled. Not a big smile, children didn't have energy for that yet, but a real smile, small and genuine. "It's soft," she said, and Kora felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. This was why she worked, why she carefully preserved her needle and her skills. To provide for her child, to add small comforts to harsh survival, to make life slightly more bearable. The nights became less desperate after the successful hunt. Sleep, while still deep and long, felt more natural, less like shutting down from lack of energy and more like actual rest. Kora's dreams continued to be vivid, but they grew less dark, less anxious. She dreamed of spring, of the earth thawing, of green things pushing up through soil, and these dreams felt like promises now rather than impossible fantasies. One night, as she lay waiting for sleep, listening to the familiar sounds of the cave, fire crackling, people breathing, the occasional shift or quiet murmur, she thought about her life, about what it meant to be her, to be human in this time. She had no concept of history, no knowledge that thousands of years stretched ahead, that her descendants would transform the world in ways she couldn't begin to imagine. She only knew this moment, this cave, this winter, this child sleeping beside her. She knew hunger and cold and the constant effort of survival, but she also knew warmth shared, work accomplished, small moments of beauty, a well-made stitch, a child's smile, firelight painting the cave walls in shades of amber. She knew connection, the deep bond of people who survived together, who shared space and breath, and the fundamental struggle of staying alive. Was she happy? The question wouldn't have made sense to her in those terms. But she was alive, and her child was alive, and the fire burned steadily, and winter, while not over, was no longer an absolute threat. That was enough. That was everything. She closed her eyes, pulled the furs closer, felt Lyra's warmth against her side, and let herself drift into sleep. The dreams that came were gentle that night, summer meadows, flowing water, the simple pleasure of warmth and abundance. And somewhere in the darkness of the cave, in the steady rhythm of breathing, in the ongoing persistence of human life against all odds, Kora rested deeply, her consciousness folding into the collective sleep of her people, all of them together waiting for morning, for spring, for the continuation of life. Now let us drift further into territory where history blurs into mystery, where the evidence we have raises questions more intriguing than the answers we can provide. Let us explore a possibility that seems strange at first, almost fantastical, yet becomes more plausible the longer we examine it. Did our ancestors, those cave dwellers of the Ice Age, do something we can barely imagine today? Did they hibernate? The question itself sounds almost absurd to modern ears. Humans don't hibernate. We're warm-blooded, active, conscious beings who pride ourselves on our ability to remain alert, productive, engaged with the world around us, regardless of season or circumstance. We sleep, certainly, but hibernation is something else entirely. A profound metabolic slowdown, a state between life and death that allows certain mammals to survive months without food. It's a biological strategy so foreign to our modern experience that we tend to think of it as belonging to an entirely different category of existence, something primitive and automatic that has nothing to do with the complexity of human life. Bears do it, retreating to their dens as autumn fades, their massive bodies sustained through winter by fat accumulated during months of feeding. Ground squirrels do it, their tiny hearts slowing to barely perceptible rhythms as they curl in underground burrows. Bats fold themselves into darkness and let their body temperature drop to near freezing, their heartbeat slowing to a handful of beats per minute, their breathing barely perceptible. These animals surrender themselves to winter completely, trusting in biological processes refined over millions of years of evolution, allowing their bodies to shut down all but the most essential functions. But humans? We're far too advanced for such primitive biology, surely. We conquered winter through intelligence, through innovation, through the uniquely human capacity to reshape our environment rather than surrendering to it. We mastered fire and shelter and clothing. We learned to store food, to plan ahead, to maintain consciousness and activity, even when nature suggested we should rest. We didn't need to shut down, we adapted our environment instead, bending the world to our will rather than allowing our bodies to bend to the world's demands. Except, and here's where the story becomes interesting, the evidence suggests something more complex, something that doesn't quite fit our assumptions about what humans can and cannot do, about the boundaries between civilization and animal existence, about the capabilities our ancestors possessed that we may have lost or forgotten. The question began, as so many archaeological mysteries do, with bones, specifically with the bones of children and adolescents found in caves in northern Spain, in a place called Atapuerca, a name that has become synonymous with some of the most important and puzzling discoveries in human prehistory. These bones, some of the oldest human remains found in Europe, were examined carefully by researchers who approached them with all the tools of modern science, microscopes and chemical analysis and comparative anatomy, and who noticed something unusual in the growth patterns, something that didn't match what they expected to find. The bones showed what are called Harris lines, dense lines that form in bones when growth is interrupted, when the body experiences severe stress or malnutrition, when the normal processes of development are forced to pause because resources are simply not available to continue. These lines appear as shadows in X-rays, darker bands running perpendicular to the length of the bone, marking moments when the body had to make impossible choices about where to direct its limited energy. Harris lines aren't uncommon in archaeological specimens. Hunger was frequent in prehistoric times, an almost constant companion to human existence, and bones record that hunger faithfully, preserving in their very structure a record of suffering and survival that can be read thousands of years later. Childhood diseases leave their marks. Seasonal food shortages create their own signatures, times of crisis, droughts, harsh winters, periods when game disappeared or plants failed. All of these register in bone as interruptions in the smooth progression of growth. But these particular lines showed something peculiar. They appeared in regular patterns, cycling patterns, suggesting that the periods of stress weren't random but seasonal, predictable, recurring with the rhythm of the year itself. Every year, these individuals experienced a time of reduced nutrition and reduced activity. Every year, their growth paused, then resumed, when conditions improved. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence, too regular to be explained by random hardship. It suggested something systematic, something that happened the same way, year after year, across multiple individuals and possibly across generations. The researchers, led by anthropologists studying the Sima de los Huesos site, the Pit of Bones, a deep chamber that has yielded thousands of human fossils from a period roughly 400,000 years ago, proposed something that seemed radical, something that challenged fundamental assumptions about human biology and behavior. They suggested that these individuals, living perhaps 400,000 years ago, earlier than our story's time frame but still relevant to understanding human capabilities, may have entered states of reduced metabolism during winter. Not full hibernation, perhaps, not the deep, coma-like state of a bear or ground squirrel, but something approaching it, a state where the body slowed down dramatically, conserving energy, redirecting resources away from growth and activity and towards simple survival, allowing life to continue through months when food was essentially unavailable, and the very act of searching for it would burn more calories than could be obtained. The proposal was met with skepticism, as scientific proposals often are when they challenge fundamental assumptions, when they ask us to reconsider things we thought we understood completely. The scientific community is properly cautious about radical ideas, especially when they concern something as basic as human physiology. But the evidence was there in the bones, undeniable, recorded in calcium and phosphate, waiting patiently for hundreds of thousands of years to be read and interpreted. These people had experienced regular, cyclical periods of physiological stress that looked in their patterns remarkably similar to what we see in hibernating animals. The similarity was too striking to ignore, even if its implications were unsettling. Let us sit with this idea for a moment. Let us imagine what it might mean, what human hibernation might have looked like, how it might have felt from the inside. Not the full, deep hibernation of a bear. Humans likely couldn't achieve that level of metabolic shutdown without significant danger, without risking the kind of damage that our more complex brains and organs cannot tolerate. But something gentler, something more subtle, and perhaps more uniquely human. A state where consciousness dims but doesn't disappear entirely, where awareness continues but becomes diffuse, dreamlike, disconnected from the urgent demands of waking life. Where metabolism slows but doesn't stop, the body entering a kind of maintenance mode, burning stored fat very slowly, very efficiently, allowing weeks or even months to pass with minimal food intake, minimal activity, minimal engagement with the external world. We have hints that such states are possible in humans, scattered evidence from modern times that suggests we haven't entirely lost the biological capacity for this kind of survival strategy. There are documented cases, rare but real and carefully verified by medical professionals, of people surviving impossible situations through what can only be described as metabolic slowdown, cases that should have ended in death but instead became medical miracles that challenged our understanding of human physiology. A Swedish man trapped in his car during a winter storm survived for 2 months in sub-zero temperatures with no food and minimal water, buried under snow in a remote location where rescue seemed impossible. When found, his body temperature had dropped to around 60 degrees Fahrenheit, far below the normal 98.6 degrees that we consider essential for human survival. His metabolism was barely ticking over, consuming energy at a rate that should have been incompatible with consciousness, with life itself. Yet he lived and eventually recovered, though the process was slow and difficult. Medical professionals examining his case struggled to explain how his body had managed to sustain itself, how his brain had avoided the damage that normally accompanies such profound hypothermia, how all his organs had continued functioning at such reduced capacity without failing completely. There are accounts from Arctic peoples, from Inuit and other northern groups who have survived in some of the harshest environments on Earth for thousands of years, of traditional winter practices that sound remarkably like voluntary hibernation, like conscious choices to enter states of reduced activity that go far beyond what we, in more temperate climates, would recognize as normal winter behavior. They would eat heavily in autumn, building up fat reserves in ways that seemed almost pathological to early European observers, but that made perfect sense in the context of their survival strategy, consuming enormous quantities of seal blubber and whale meat and fish oil, their bodies transforming this abundance into insulation and stored energy. Then, as darkness descended and temperatures plummeted to levels that made outdoor activity not just difficult, but genuinely life-threatening, They would spend the darkest winter months in a state of profound rest, of almost suspended animation. Not sleeping continuously, that would be dangerous, impossible to maintain, but existing in a twilight state, a kind of existence that early anthropologists struggled to categorize or understand. They would wake briefly to tend fires that could never be allowed to go completely out, to perform minimal activities necessary for immediate survival, to consume small amounts of food, to check on family members, to adjust positions and maintain circulation. Then they would sink back into deep, restorative sleep that lasted not hours but days, sleep so profound that waking them took significant effort, sleep that seemed to carry them to places beyond normal dreaming. The anthropologist Vilhjalmur Stefansson, who lived among the Inuit in the early 20th century and who approached their way of life with unusual respect and willingness to learn, described these practices with fascination, though he admitted he struggled to convey the reality of what he observed to audiences back in the industrialized world who had no frame of reference for such existence. He wrote of families who would essentially sleep through the worst of winter, their igloos or winter houses becoming cocoons of warmth and darkness where time seemed to stop. They emerged periodically for necessities but otherwise remained in their shelters in states of deep rest that seemed almost meditative. Their metabolism slowed, measurably so their body temperature dropped slightly, not to dangerous levels, but enough to make a difference in energy conservation, and they required remarkably little food during these periods, far less than would be expected for humans of their size maintaining normal activity levels. Was this cultural practice or biological capability? Perhaps both, intertwined in ways that make them impossible to separate completely. Perhaps humans retained, far longer than we've assumed, the ability to enter these reduced states when conditions demanded it, and perhaps northern peoples living in environments that demanded this strategy preserved and refined practices that helped them access this biological capacity more reliably, more safely, more effectively. Perhaps this ability was essential to survival in Ice Age Europe, where winters lasted 6 months or more, and food availability dropped to nearly nothing, where the energy cost of hunting and gathering during the coldest months would have exceeded any possible benefit, where staying active could mean starvation, but staying still meant survival. Consider the caves themselves, those remarkable spaces that have fascinated us since their discovery. Not as mere shelters, not simply as convenient places to escape the weather, but as hibernation chambers, spaces specifically chosen for their capacity to support this kind of extended rest. The Chauvet Cave in southern France, with its extraordinary gallery of painted animals that represent some of the finest artistic achievements of the Paleolithic period, lies deep within a limestone cliff, its entrance high above the valley floor, protected from flooding and from the worst of the weather. Studies have shown that the interior maintains a relatively constant temperature year-round, cold, certainly, hovering around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, but stable, unchanging regardless of external conditions. No wind penetrates these deep chambers. The darkness is absolute, complete, the kind of darkness that city dwellers never experience, that swallows light completely. The air is still and quiet, the silence so profound that you can hear your own heartbeat, your own breathing amplified in the enclosed space. These are precisely the conditions that hibernating animals seek, conditions that we now know are essential for successful hibernation. Stability matters more than warmth. What animals need is predictability, an environment where their reduced metabolism won't be shocked by sudden temperature swings, where they can remain in their dormant state without having to rouse themselves to respond to changing conditions. Darkness, too, is essential, allowing the body's circadian rhythms to settle into patterns that wouldn't be possible with the stimulus of regular light and dark cycles. Protection from external temperature swings, from wind and precipitation, and the physical disturbances that the external world constantly provides. All of these factors make the difference between successful hibernation and dangerous exposure. Did early humans choose these caves instinctively, drawn by the same biological imperatives that draw bears to dens and bats to deep caverns? Did they recognize, perhaps without being able to articulate why, that these spaces were right for the kind of winter survival strategy they needed to employ? The careful selection of cave sites suggests intentionality, suggests that people understood what they needed and sought it out deliberately. Not every cave was used, not every shelter was considered suitable. The ones that were chosen, that show evidence of long-term human occupation, that bear the marks of repeated return across generations. These tend to share certain characteristics. They're deep enough to provide thermal stability. They're protected from the elements. They're secure from predators with entrances that can be monitored or blocked. They're, in short, ideal hibernation sites. The painted animals themselves offer another mystery within the mystery, another layer of strangeness that becomes more intriguing the more we examine it. The art in these caves, horses galloping across limestone walls, bison rendered with such anatomical precision that species can be identified, mammoths drawn from memory with such accuracy that their seasonal weight variations are visible, predators like cave lions and cave bears depicted with respect and fear, and perhaps something approaching awe, is rendered with extraordinary skill and care, demonstrating a level of artistic sophistication that challenges our assumptions about prehistoric people. The artists who created these images understood anatomy, understood movement and weight and proportion, captured the essence of these creatures with remarkable fidelity, with a quality of observation and representation that wouldn't be matched again for tens of thousands of years. But they also created them in the deepest, most difficult-to-reach parts of the caves, in chambers that required navigating narrow passages and crawling through spaces barely large enough for a human body, sometimes for hundreds of meters into the earth. In absolute darkness, where lamps would need to be carried and maintained with precious fuel, where each stroke of charcoal or application of pigment required careful planning because mistakes couldn't easily be corrected. In spaces that required significant physical effort to reach, significant risk to access, significant resources to illuminate, long enough to complete the work. Why? If these were simply decorative or even religious art in the conventional sense, why place them where they could barely be seen, where visiting them required such effort and risk? Why not create these magnificent works near the entrance, where light would naturally illuminate them, where the whole community could view them easily and regularly? The placement seems deliberately difficult, deliberately hidden, suggesting that the purpose of these images was something other than public display, something that required privacy, isolation, darkness. Unless, and here's a possibility that feels both strange and somehow right, that seems to fit the evidence in ways that more conventional explanations don't, unless these deep caves were the sleeping chambers, the hibernation spaces, the places where people spent months in states of reduced consciousness, and the art was meant to accompany dreams, to serve as companions and guides for minds that wandered between waking and sleeping for weeks on end. Think about it. You're in a state of semi-hibernation, drifting in and out of consciousness. Your body conserved energy by shutting down all but essential functions, your mind wandering through landscapes that feel more real than the physical cave around you. You wake periodically in absolute darkness, disoriented, uncertain whether minutes or days have passed since your last conscious moment. There's only the dim glow of a carefully tended lamp, burning rendered animal fat with a smoky, flickering flame that casts more shadows than light. And there, on the walls around you, revealed gradually, as your eyes adjust and the lamplight plays across the uneven surface, are the animals. Not just representations of animals, not mere decoration, but images so vivid, so alive that in the flickering lamplight they seem to breathe, seem to move, seem to watch you with eyes that hold intelligence and perhaps recognition. Your mind, hovering between wake and sleep, still partly lost in the dreams you've been experiencing for days, processes these images not as art, but as visions, as dreams made visible, as confirmation that the worlds you've been traveling through in your sleep are real, are accessible, are important. The painted bison becomes the bison you've been dreaming of, the one that spoke to you in the language without words that exists only in dreams. The horse becomes your guide, the creature that showed you how to run with the herd, how to feel the joy of speed and strength and freedom from human limitations. The mammoth becomes the ancient wisdom you've been seeking, the connection to powers and knowledge beyond ordinary human experience. Many researchers have noted the dreamlike quality of cave art, the ways in which it seems to operate according to logic different from waking consciousness. The way animals are layered over each other, sometimes clearly, sometimes faintly, creating palimpsests where multiple time periods and multiple visions coexist in the same space. The way figures appear and disappear depending on the angle of light, on where the viewer stands, on how shadows fall across the uneven rock surface, so that the experience of viewing becomes dynamic, constantly changing, never quite stable. The way the natural contours of rock are incorporated into the images, so that a bulge becomes a bison's shoulder, perfectly positioned, a crack becomes a horse's leg in mid-stride, a natural protrusion becomes the eye of a watching predator. This isn't the art of full consciousness, of careful daylight planning where every element can be controlled and predicted. This is something else, something born from altered states, from minds that moved fluidly between waking and dreaming, that saw the world as malleable, transformable, alive with meaning and possibility. Shamanic practices, which we know existed in later prehistoric periods, and which continue in various forms in indigenous cultures around the world, often involved entering trance states to access spiritual realms, to travel to places where the normal rules of physical existence don't apply. The shaman would use various techniques: rhythmic drumming that altered brain waves, fasting that produced metabolic changes and enhanced sensitivity, sleep deprivation that broke down the barriers between conscious and unconscious mind, perhaps psychoactive plants that opened doors to perception that normally remain closed. Through these techniques, the shaman would alter consciousness deliberately, would travel into the spirit world, would encounter animals and ancestors and powers that existed beyond normal human awareness. In these journeys, the shaman would receive messages and visions that could be brought back to help the community, that could provide guidance for hunting or healing or understanding the forces that shape their world. But what if the winter itself was the trance? What if those months of darkness, of minimal food intake, of long sleep broken by brief wakeful periods, created a natural altered state that required no artificial enhancement, no special techniques beyond simply surrendering to what the season demanded? The body, stressed by cold and hunger, produces endorphins, natural opiates that reduce pain and create feelings of peace, of well-being, of connection to something larger than individual consciousness. The mind, deprived of the constant stimulation of external input, deprived of the structure that waking activity provides, floating between sleep and wake for days at a time, becomes more receptive to internal imagery, to the voices and visions that emerge from within rather than from without. Modern neuroscience has shown that the brain doesn't simply shut down during sleep, but continues its own intense activity, processing memories, solving problems, creating narratives and images that feel completely real while we're experiencing them. Dreams draw on the same neural structures that create waking consciousness, activate the same visual and emotional centers, engage the same storytelling capacities that we use to make sense of our daily lives. But they do so without the constraints of physical reality, without the need to correspond to external sensory input, and the result is a kind of creativity, a kind of freedom that waking consciousness rarely achieves. In extended sleep, especially sleep accompanied by the metabolic changes of semi-hibernation, these dreams would become extraordinarily vivid, more real in some ways than waking life. They would last longer, develop more complex narratives, create entire worlds that could be explored and inhabited. You might dream that you were an animal, and the dream would last so long, feel so real, so complete in its sensory detail and emotional truth, that you would begin to forget you were human, would begin to experience the world as that animal experiences it. The prey's constant awareness of danger, the predator's focus and patience, the herd animal's sense of belonging and safety in numbers. You might dream of other times, other places, landscapes and situations that feel like memories, even though they can't possibly be memories, that carry the weight and detail of lived experience, even though you know, in whatever small part of your mind remains analytical, that they must be inventions, constructions, fantasies. But in the dream state, this knowledge doesn't matter. The dreams feel true, and their truth is more important, more meaningful than the merely factual truth of waking life. You would lose track of which time was real, which place was home, which version of yourself was the true one, and sometimes perhaps you would dream together. There's evidence, controversial but intriguing, accumulating from various sources but still not definitively proven, that people in close proximity, sharing space and air and routine, begin to synchronize their physiological rhythms in ways that extend beyond the obvious. Women living together often synchronize their menstrual cycles. People who spend significant time together often align their sleep patterns, their breathing rates, even their heart rhythms. And there are reports, anecdotal but remarkably consistent across cultures, that dreaming too can synchronize, that people sharing space sometimes report remarkably similar dream content, similar imagery and themes and narratives that seem too coincidental to be explained by chance alone. If this is true and the evidence is far from conclusive, the mechanisms unknown, the very idea challenging to test with scientific rigor, imagine what it would mean for a group hibernating together in a cave, their bodies pressed close for warmth, their breathing synchronized by proximity and by the shared rhythm of reduced metabolism, their minds all wandering in similar states of altered consciousness for weeks or months. Their dreams might interweave, creating shared narratives and visions, collective experiences that belonged not to individuals, but to the group as a whole. They might dream the same animals, the same spirits, the same journeys through impossible landscapes. They might encounter each other in their dreams, communicate in ways that bypassed language, share knowledge and feeling directly, mind to mind. When they woke and spoke of their dreams, if they spoke of them, if they had language developed enough to convey such experiences, they would find common threads, shared symbols, recurring themes that appeared in multiple people's accounts. And this would reinforce their sense of connection, of being part of something larger than individual consciousness, of belonging to a tribe that was unified not just by kinship and cooperation, but by shared inner experience, by having traveled together through realms beyond the physical world. The dreams would become the tribe's mythology, the foundation of their understanding of the world and their place in it. The animals encountered in dreams would become totems, guides, sources of wisdom and power. The landscapes explored in sleep would become sacred geography, maps of spiritual territory that was as real and as important as the physical landscape they hunted and gathered in during waking seasons. The transformations experienced in dreams, becoming animal, flying, traveling to the sky or under the earth, would become the core narratives of what it meant to be human, what humans were capable of, how they related to the larger web of life. This is speculation, of course. We're far beyond what the evidence can definitively prove, into territory where imagination must supplement the fragmentary record that archaeology provides. But speculation, when it's grounded in what we know about human biology, about sleep and consciousness, about the ways minds work under extreme conditions, when it draws on both ancient evidence and modern understanding, opens possibilities that are worth considering. And these possibilities help us understand not just the past, but ourselves. why we sleep as we do, why winter affects us as it does, why we carry within us the remnants of capacities we no longer use but haven't quite lost, echoes of ways of being that served our ancestors well for hundreds of thousands of years. The transition out of hibernation, when it finally came after months of darkness and stillness, must have been gradual, as slow and subtle as the winter's onset had been. Nothing in nature changes instantly, and the human body, especially in a state of profound metabolic slowdown, couldn't simply switch from hibernation to full activity without risk. As winter loosened its grip, as days lengthened imperceptibly at first, and then with increasing speed, as temperatures climbed from impossible to merely brutal to almost tolerable, as the sun's angle shifted and its warmth began to penetrate again into the northern latitudes, the body would begin to wake. Metabolism would speed up, degree by degree, the body sensing somehow that the time of conservation was ending, that energy could be spent more freely again. Hunger would return, not suddenly but gradually, a growing awareness that the body needed food, needed fuel, to rebuild what had been consumed during the long sleep. Energy would slowly rebuild. Muscles that had atrophied slightly during months of minimal use would begin to respond again. The capacity for movement and effort would return incrementally. The deep sleep would become lighter, more easily broken, more fragmented. The dreams would fade, becoming less vivid, less consuming, less real than they had been, transitioning back into the quick, forgettable dreams of normal sleep. And one morning, or perhaps one evening, time still uncertain after months of darkness and disconnection from natural cycles, you would wake and know that something had changed, that the long winter was truly ending. The air would smell different, carrying a hint of moisture, of thaw, of earth exposed after months under ice and snow. The sounds outside the cave would shift, ice melting, dripping, cracking, water beginning to flow again in streams that had been frozen solid, the first tentative calls of birds returning from wherever they had spent the winter, creatures stirring from their own long sleep. Your body would feel different too, lighter somehow, despite the weight loss, ready to move after months of stillness, eager for activity and stimulation and engagement with the world. There would be stiffness, certainly, weakness from disuse, but also a sense of renewal, of having been reset, of starting fresh. You would be hungry, genuinely hungry, for the first time in months, and the prospect of food, of hunting and gathering, of tasting fresh meat and early spring plants, would be compelling in a way that transcends mere appetite, that speaks to deep biological drives. The emergence from the cave would be almost like birth, a transition from one mode of existence to another so profound that it would feel like becoming a new person. The light, even pale, late winter light, would be shocking after months of darkness, painful almost, requiring adjustment, squinting, shading eyes that had forgotten what brightness meant. The space, the vast openness of the external world, would feel overwhelming after the close confines of the cave, after months in enclosed darkness where the walls were always within reach, where space was limited and known. The world would seem enormous, infinite, full of possibilities and dangers. But there would also be joy, or the exhausted echo of joy, the knowledge that you survived, that winter didn't claim you, that you outlasted the cold and darkness and hunger, that life continues, that the cycle persists, that spring will come again just as it always has, that the strategies and instincts that guided you through winter proved adequate once more. There would be reunion with others who had hibernated elsewhere, exchange of news, discovery of who survived and who didn't, rebuilding of social connections that had been dormant during the months of isolation. Whether our ancestors truly hibernated in the physiological sense, entering states comparable to what bears and ground squirrels experience, or simply practiced an extreme form of winter rest, a culturally refined strategy for surviving impossible conditions, the result was fundamentally the same. They survived conditions that should have killed them, that would kill us if we were suddenly transported to that time and place without the knowledge and adaptations they possessed. They endured months of darkness and cold and hunger, conditions that test the limits of what human biology can withstand, and they did it not through constant activity and resistance, not through fighting against winter with all their strength, but through surrender, through acceptance of what winter demanded, through working with their biology rather than against it, through sleeping deeply, dreaming vividly, and trusting that spring would come again, that the world would renew itself, that patience and stillness could be survival strategies as effective as activity and struggle. There's something in this story, in this possibility of ancestral hibernation, that speaks directly to our modern condition, that offers insights we desperately need in a world that seems to have forgotten the wisdom of rest. We've lost the ability, if we ever had it, to truly rest, to stop, to simply be without doing. We fight against winter, against darkness, against the natural rhythms that once governed human life and that still pulse within our biology, whether we acknowledge them or not. We light the night with artificial brilliance, banishing darkness completely, creating a world where time has no natural markers, where day and night blur together in an endless present of potential productivity. We heat our homes to summer temperatures year-round, maintaining the same environment in January as in July, insulating ourselves from seasonal change, creating a bubble of artificial spring that requires enormous energy to maintain. We expect ourselves to maintain the same productivity and energy regardless of season, to be equally creative and active and enthusiastic in the dark depths of winter as in the bright abundance of summer. And we suffer for it in ways we're only beginning to understand and acknowledge. We're tired, chronically tired, our sleep disrupted and insufficient, our rest never quite restful enough because we never fully surrender to it. We're anxious, unable to simply be still, always feeling we should be doing something, achieving something, moving forward, making progress toward goals that often feel arbitrary, but that drive us nonetheless. We've conquered winter, in practical terms, but lost something essential in the process, the ability to slow down, to hibernate in whatever way our bodies need, to trust that rest is not laziness but survival, not weakness but wisdom. We've forgotten, or perhaps never learned, that consciousness doesn't have to be constant, that productivity isn't the measure of worth, that there's value in the dark, quiet spaces where nothing happens, where time passes slowly, where the mind turns inward rather than constantly engaging with external demands. We've lost touch with the seasonal rhythms that shaped our evolution, that created the biology we still carry, and the cost of this disconnection manifests in epidemic levels of depression, anxiety, sleep disorders, metabolic diseases that seem to arise from the fundamental mismatch between how we're designed to live and how we actually live. Perhaps that's the real lesson from these ancient sleepers, these people who might have hibernated through Ice Age winters. That rest is not the opposite of productivity, but its foundation, that you cannot maintain constant output without periods of profound input, without times of stillness and reflection and renewal. That there's wisdom in surrendering to natural cycles rather than fighting them, in acknowledging that humans are seasonal creatures despite our efforts to transcend seasonality, that sometimes the most courageous, most adaptive thing you can do is simply sleep, deeply and trustingly, knowing you'll wake when you're ready, knowing that spring, literal or metaphorical, will come again, as it always has, as it always will, if we can simply be patient enough to wait for it. The evidence for human hibernation remains circumstantial, controversial, debated among specialists who bring different assumptions and methods to the question. We cannot prove definitively that it happened, cannot observe it directly, cannot measure the metabolism of people 40,000 years ago. But we can note the patterns in bones, the choice of caves, the nature of the art, the genetic remnants of torpor capacity, the documented cases of modern humans surviving through metabolic slowdown, the practices of Arctic peoples, the ways that winter still affects us despite our best efforts to ignore its influence. We can acknowledge that humans are more capable, more adaptable, more biologically flexible than we sometimes assume, that our ancestors developed strategies for survival that we can barely imagine because they're so foreign to our experience. And we can consider what we might learn from them, what wisdom we might reclaim from a time when humans lived more closely aligned with natural cycles, when rest was recognized as necessary rather than shameful, when winter was a time for dreams rather than a season to be conquered and ignored. In the end, whether our ancestors truly hibernated or not may matter less than what the possibility teaches us about ourselves, about the relationship between humans and nature, about the value of rest and darkness and dreams. The story invites us to reconsider our assumptions, to question whether our modern way of life, with its constant activity and artificial light and disconnection from natural rhythms, is truly superior to older ways of being, or whether we've sacrificed something essential in our quest for year-round productivity. As winter arrives each year, as days shorten and temperatures drop and something in our biology responds with fatigue and introversion, perhaps we should listen to those ancient voices, should honor the seasonal wisdom encoded in our genes, should allow ourselves to rest more deeply than we usually permit. Not hibernating in the literal sense, we have lives to live, responsibilities to meet, work to do, but finding ways to slow down, to simplify, to create space for the kind of deep rest that our ancestors might have practiced, that our bodies might still need even in this bright, heated, endlessly stimulating world we've created. Perhaps on the darkest nights of winter we should turn off some lights, should sit in firelight or candlelight, should allow ourselves to experience something closer to the darkness our ancestors knew. Perhaps we should sleep more, rest more, dream more, give ourselves permission to be less productive, less active, less constantly engaged. Perhaps we should recognize that the winter fatigue and introspection we often fight against might be our biology trying to tell us something important, trying to guide us toward rhythms that supported human life for hundreds of thousands of years before we decided we could transcend them completely. The cave paintings remain, silent witnesses to ways of being we can barely understand, art created by people who might have spent months each year in states of consciousness we never experience, who might have accessed realms of dream and vision that our busy, stimulated, constantly illuminated minds cannot reach. They speak to us across tens of thousands of years, these images of animals and hands, these marks made in darkness by people whose lives we can only imagine. And perhaps what they're telling us, if we can learn to listen, is that there's wisdom in rest, power in darkness, truth in dreams, and that the path to understanding ourselves fully might require acknowledging our kinship not just with these ancient artists, but with the hibernating bears, the sleeping bats, the creatures who understand instinctively what we've forgotten, that winter is for rest, that darkness is for dreams, and that spring will always return to those who have the patience and courage to wait. Let us turn now to a different kind of warmth, a different quality of rest. We've explored the common experience of winter survival, the shared suffering and shared sleep of the tribe huddled together against the cold. But even in those ancient times, even in communities so small that everyone knew everyone else intimately, differences existed. Hierarchies emerged. Some slept warmer than others. This isn't a comfortable truth. We like to imagine prehistoric communities as egalitarian, as pure expressions of human cooperation before civilization corrupted us with inequality. And there's some truth to that vision. These were small bands where survival depended on cooperation, where individualism could mean death. But humans are complicated creatures, and even in the simplest societies, status finds ways to manifest. We carry within us instincts for both equality and hierarchy, impulses toward both sharing and claiming, and these contradictions played out even in the most ancient human groups. The romanticized vision of prehistoric life as a kind of primitive paradise, free from the corruptions of power and status, doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Yes, these were small communities where everyone depended on everyone else. Yes, resources were limited in ways that forced sharing and cooperation. Yes, survival required collective action in ways that modern life rarely demands. But within these constraints, within this framework of necessary cooperation, humans still found ways to differentiate themselves, to establish hierarchies, to create systems where some individuals held more influence, received more respect, and yes, enjoyed more comfort than others. The fire was the first marker of difference. We've spoken of fire as though it belonged equally to everyone, but that was never quite true. Fire required knowledge to create, skill to maintain, and courage to protect. Someone had to know which stones would spark properly when struck together, which tinder would catch most reliably, which wood burned longest and hottest. This knowledge wasn't universal. It was held by specific individuals and taught carefully to chosen apprentices. The creation of fire wasn't a simple task that anyone could accomplish. It required patience, skill, and deep knowledge of materials. The firekeeper needed to understand how different types of stone produced different qualities of spark. Flint and pyrite, when struck together correctly, would produce the hot sparks needed to ignite tinder, but the angle of the strike mattered, the force applied mattered, the condition of the stones mattered. A stone that had become too smooth from use would fail to spark effectively. A strike at the wrong angle would produce sparks too cool to ignite anything. The firekeeper knew these details intimately through years of practice and observation. The tinder itself required knowledge to prepare and maintain. The inner bark of certain trees, dried and shredded into fine fibers, made excellent tinder. But it had to be kept absolutely dry, protected from moisture in pouches made from animal bladders or stored in the driest parts of the cave. Dried grass, certain types of fungus, even bird nests, all of these could serve as tinder, but each had different properties, different optimal conditions for ignition. The firekeeper knew which materials worked best in different weather conditions, which could be relied upon when everything else failed. And then there was the knowledge of wood itself. Not all wood burns equally. Hardwoods like oak burned slowly and produced long-lasting coals that radiated heat for hours. Softwoods like pine ignited more easily, but burned quickly, better for getting a fire started than for maintaining it through a long winter night. Some woods produced heavy smoke that could make a cave uninhabitable, others burned cleaner. Some woods sparked dangerously, sending embers flying that could ignite bedding or clothing, others burned steadily and safely. The firekeeper understood all of this, knew which woods to use when, knew how to mix different types to achieve the desired heat and duration. The firekeeper, or firekeepers, as there were usually several in a group, held a position of quiet power. They didn't rule in any formal sense. Such concepts didn't exist yet. But they were essential, and everyone knew it. When they spoke, others listened. When they needed something, a particular kind of wood, a specific tool, assistance with a task, it was provided. And when night came, when sleeping positions were arranged around the fire, they slept closest to the center, closest to the warmth. This position wasn't claimed through force or explicit demand. Rather, it emerged naturally from the group's recognition of value. The firekeeper's role was too important to risk them becoming sick from cold or exhausted from poor sleep. If the firekeeper couldn't function properly, if their hands became too cold to strike sparks effectively, or their mind too foggy from poor rest to remember the crucial details of fire maintenance, everyone suffered. So the community ensured that the firekeeper slept well, stayed warm, remained healthy and capable. It was practical wisdom disguised as privilege. It was subtle, this difference. Perhaps only a foot or two closer to the flames. But that foot made a profound difference in comfort. Temperature gradients in a cave are steep. Move a few feet away from the fire, and the cold intensifies dramatically. Those sleeping in the innermost circle, pressed closest to the warmth, experienced winter differently than those on the outer edges. The difference wasn't just about physical warmth, though that mattered enormously. It was about the quality of rest achieved. Those closest to the fire could sleep more deeply because their bodies didn't have to work as hard to maintain core temperature. Their muscles could relax fully instead of tensing against the cold. Their breathing could slow to the deep rhythms of genuine rest instead of remaining shallow and rapid. The body's response to cold stress. They woke more refreshed, with more energy to face the day's demands, and this advantage compounded over time. Through a long winter, the difference between sleeping warm and sleeping cold could mean the difference between maintaining strength and vitality or slowly succumbing to the cumulative exhaustion that made people vulnerable to illness and injury. The heat radiating from a fire doesn't distribute evenly. It follows the inverse square law. Intensity decreases dramatically with distance. Someone sleeping 3 feet from the flames might experience temperatures 20 or 30 degrees warmer than someone sleeping 6 feet away. In a cave where ambient temperature might hover just above freezing, this difference was everything. At 3 feet, your exposed face might feel almost uncomfortably hot, while your back remained pleasantly warm. At 6 feet, you'd be cold enough to shiver intermittently, your sleep interrupted by your body's trembling attempts to generate heat. At 9 feet, at the outer edges where the youngest and least valuable sleepers huddled together, the cold would be relentless, broken only by the warmth of other bodies pressed close. The elders too claimed these favored positions. Age, in a time when most people died young, was itself a form of status. To survive into your 40s or 50s meant you had accumulated decades of knowledge, had weathered countless winters, had skills and wisdom that the young desperately needed. The elders weren't merely tolerated, they were valued, even revered. And that value manifested in small ways: extra furs, slightly larger portions during desperate times, and yes, sleeping positions closer to the fire. The elders carried in their memories information that couldn't be stored any other way. They remembered patterns of weather from decades past, could predict with reasonable accuracy when spring might come based on subtle signs the young hadn't learned to read. They knew which valleys tended to flood during early thaw and which remained safe. They remembered years when certain plants had failed and what the group had eaten instead to survive. They knew the locations of good flint deposits, some of them days of travel away, places discovered in their youth that the group might need again. They remembered which individuals were related to which, information crucial for avoiding inbreeding in these small populations. They carried songs and stories that encoded practical information about edible plants, about animal behavior, about how to navigate by stars. This knowledge wasn't written down, couldn't be written down. It lived only in human memory, and when an elder died, vast repositories of information died with them. The community understood this intuitively, even if they couldn't articulate it in these terms. They understood that keeping the elders alive, keeping them healthy and rested and capable of remembering, was essential to everyone's survival. So the elders slept warm, they ate adequately, they were protected and cared for, not out of sentimentality but out of cold, practical necessity. But there was more to it than mere utility. The elders had earned their comfort through decades of contribution. They had hunted when they were young and strong, had borne and raised children, had gathered food and tanned hides and made tools. They had already given the community decades of labor. Now, in their declining years, The community returned that investment by ensuring they could live out their remaining time in relative comfort. It was a kind of social contract, unspoken but understood. Contribute when you can, and you will be cared for when you cannot. There was one individual in particular who deserves our attention. Let us call him Tarn. Again, not his real name, but a sound that might have belonged to that distant time. Tarn was what we might call a shaman, though that word comes from much later and carries connotations he would never have understood. He was a person who spoke with the spirits, who entered trance states and returned with knowledge, who painted the sacred animals on cave walls and interpreted the meaning of dreams. How did one become such a person? Not through choice, usually, but through what the community recognized as signs. Perhaps Tarn had been a sickly child who nearly died but recovered, marked by that brush with death. Perhaps he had seizures, what we would now understand as epilepsy, that his people interpreted as moments when the spirits entered him. Perhaps he simply had an unusual mind, one that made connections others missed, that saw patterns and meanings in the natural world that felt significant and true. Or perhaps Tarn had experienced a dramatic vision or dream in adolescence, something so vivid and strange that the community recognized it as a calling from the spirit world. These experiences, which we might now understand as episodes of sleep paralysis, intense fever dreams, or even the effects of accidentally ingesting psychoactive plants, were interpreted by the community as moments when the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds became permeable, when a person was chosen to serve as a bridge between realms. The path to becoming what we would call a shaman often involved a period of illness or crisis. Tarn might have withdrawn from normal community life for a time, spending days or weeks in isolation, fasting, entering altered states of consciousness. The community would have watched this transformation with a mixture of fear and hope. Fear because such behavior seemed strange and dangerous. Hope because they needed someone to fill this role, someone to mediate between the known world and the mysterious forces that governed it. Whatever the origin of his status, Tarn occupied a unique position in his community. He didn't hunt, not regularly. He didn't gather food or scrape hides or perform the usual labor that sustained the group. Instead, he tended the sacred aspects of life, the paintings, the rituals, the interpretations of omens and dreams. And the community accepted this arrangement because they needed what he provided. They needed meaning, needed explanation, needed someone to mediate between the visible world and the invisible forces that shape their lives. The need for meaning is as fundamental to human survival as the need for food and warmth. People can endure extraordinary hardship if they believe it has purpose, if they can fit their suffering into some larger framework of understanding. But random suffering, meaningless hardship threatens to break human spirits in ways that physical privation alone cannot. Tarn provided the framework. When a child died, he explained it as the spirits calling the child home. When hunting failed repeatedly, he performed rituals to appease the animal spirits and restore balance. When someone dreamed of threatening images, he interpreted the symbolism and suggested actions to prevent the imagined danger from manifesting. Was any of this real in a supernatural sense? We cannot know, but it was real in its effects. When Tarn declared that the spirits were satisfied, people felt reassured and could focus their energy on practical survival tasks rather than being paralyzed by anxiety. When he declared that a particular direction would yield good hunting, and the hunters went that way and succeeded, their confidence increased, making future hunts more likely to succeed. When he performed healing rituals over the sick, the psychological comfort might have helped people's bodies fight off illness more effectively. The placebo effect is real and measurable, and while Tarn couldn't have understood it in modern terms, he worked with it intuitively, providing the psychological conditions that helped people survive. Tarn's sleeping space was separate from the main group. Not completely isolated, that would be dangerous and wasteful of warmth, but set apart. Perhaps in a small alcove deeper in the cave, a space naturally divided by rock formations or deliberately partitioned with hanging hides. This separation served multiple purposes. It marked his status as different, as special. It provided privacy for the visions and trances he entered. And practically it meant he could maintain his own smaller fire, could control his environment more precisely than those sleeping communally. The alcove was chosen carefully. It needed to be protected from drafts, warm enough to be comfortable, but not so close to the main living area that ordinary activities would disturb Tarn's work. It needed to have walls suitable for painting. The sacred images he created were often located near where he slept, so he could contemplate them as he entered and emerged from trance states. The location needed to feel separate, liminal, a space between the ordinary world and the spiritual realm he claimed to access. The entrance to this alcove might have been marked in some way. Antlers arranged in a specific pattern, stones painted with ochre, arrangements of bones. These markers served to remind the community that this was not ordinary space, that entering it uninvited would be transgression, that what happened within belonged to Tarn's specialized domain. Children were taught from early age to respect these boundaries, to understand that Tarn's space was different from the communal areas where they could move freely. This smaller fire was fed more carefully, more consistently than the main fire. It never died completely because Tarn, or an apprentice who slept nearby, woke regularly to tend it. The wood used was sometimes special, selected for particular properties. Certain woods, when burned, produced smoke with mild psychoactive effects. Juniper created a sweet, slightly intoxicating smoke. Certain fungi, when dried and burned, produced vapors that altered consciousness, gently but noticeably. We know this because we've found evidence in the caves, residues of these materials in the areas where fires burned, concentrations that suggest intentional use rather than random selection. The people of that time knew plants and their properties intimately. They knew which barks could ease pain, which roots could settle upset stomachs, which leaves could induce sleep or alter dreams. This knowledge wasn't scientific in our sense, but it was empirical, tested over generations, refined through careful observation of cause and effect. The pharmacological knowledge these ancient people possessed would astound us if we could somehow reconstruct it fully. They knew, for instance, that willow bark contained compounds that reduced pain and fever, the same compounds we now extract and synthesize as aspirin. They knew that certain mushrooms could heal infections, containing what we now know as antibiotic compounds. They understood that poppy sap could ease severe pain and induce sleep. They recognized which plants caused hallucinations and which caused poisoning, and they understood the fine line between therapeutic dose and dangerous overdose. This knowledge was accumulated slowly over countless generations. Someone, at some point in the distant past, had eaten a particular plant and felt their headache ease. Someone else noticed that poultices made from certain leaves seemed to help wounds heal faster. These observations were remembered, tested, refined. The doses that worked were discovered through trial and error. The preparations that made medicines more effective, drying, heating, mixing with other substances, were developed gradually through experimentation. Tarn, as the community's spiritual specialist, was also likely its pharmacological expert. He knew which plants to gather, when to gather them for maximum potency, how to prepare them. He knew which smokes induced visions and which merely made people drowsy. He understood combinations, that mixing certain plants enhanced their effects, while other combinations neutralized them or became dangerous. This knowledge was part of his power, part of what made him invaluable to the community. So Tarn would sit through the long winter nights, breathing smoke that made the darkness more alive with visions, that made the painted animals on the walls seem to move and speak. He would enter trance states where his consciousness expanded or contracted. Accounts of shamanic experience describe both. And in these states, he would receive messages, would understand things that normal consciousness couldn't grasp. The trance state was cultivated deliberately through multiple techniques. The psychoactive smoke helped, but it wasn't the only tool. Tarn would fast before entering deep trances, knowing that hunger made the mind more susceptible to altered states. He would use rhythmic drumming or chanting, perhaps beating a simple drum made from stretched hide, or chanting repetitive phrases until the sounds lost meaning and became pure vibration. He would stare into the flames until his ordinary vision blurred and he began to see patterns and images in the dancing fire. In these altered states, the normal boundaries of consciousness became permeable. Memories from his own past would surface with unusual clarity, mixing with images from the present, from the paintings on the walls, from stories he had heard. His mind would make unusual connections, would perceive relationships between things that seemed unconnected in normal consciousness. He would feel emotions with extraordinary intensity, terror, ecstasy, profound sadness, transcendent joy, all washing through him in waves as the fire flickered and the painted animals seemed to watch him from the walls. What was happening in his brain during these experiences? Modern neuroscience gives us some insights. The psychoactive compounds in the smoke would have affected neurotransmitter systems, altering the balance of serotonin, dopamine, and other chemicals that regulate consciousness. The fasting would have shifted his metabolism, producing ketones that affect brain function. The sensory deprivation of sitting in darkness broken only by firelight would have changed normal patterns of neural activity. The rhythmic stimulation of drumming or chanting would have induced specific brainwave patterns associated with altered consciousness. But knowing the mechanisms doesn't necessarily diminish the significance of the experiences. In these states, Tarn's unconscious mind could process complex information in ways that conscious analysis couldn't achieve. He might have insights about social problems in the group, understanding patterns of tension and alliance that were invisible to conscious observation. He might perceive subtle environmental changes that his conscious mind had noticed but not registered. He might recall details from decades-old memories that proved relevant to current problems. His sleeping was different from the communal sleep we've described. It was more active, more intentional. He would sleep lightly, wake to tend the fire, and breathe more of the sacred smoke, then sink back into sleep that was really a kind of controlled dreaming. He cultivated this ability, trained his mind to remain partially aware even in deep sleep, to direct his dreams toward productive visions rather than random mental noise. This practice of conscious dreaming, of maintaining awareness within sleep, appears in shamanic traditions worldwide. It requires training and discipline. Tarn would have developed this skill over years, learning to recognize when he was dreaming, to maintain a thread of waking consciousness, even as most of his mind surrendered to sleep. In this liminal state, he could observe his dreams as they unfolded, could sometimes influence their direction, could remember them with unusual clarity upon waking. The boundary between waking and sleeping wasn't sharp for Tarn the way it is for most people. His days blended into his nights in a continuous stream of altered consciousness. He might drowse during the day, entering brief dream states while sitting by the fire. He might wake multiple times during the night, each waking accompanied by visions or insights. His sleep was fragmented but rich, filled with imagery and meaning that ordinary sleep rarely provides. This constant movement between states of consciousness took a toll. Tarn probably suffered from chronic fatigue, from the exhaustion that comes from never quite being fully awake or fully asleep. His nervous system was constantly stimulated, constantly processing unusual sensory and emotional experiences, but this was considered the price of his calling, the sacrifice required to serve as the community's bridge to the spiritual realm. The community brought him their questions and concerns. if someone was ill, if the hunting had been poor, if tensions arose between individuals, if strange things were seen or heard, all of this would be brought to Tarn, and he would sleep on it, literally. He would enter his altered states and seek guidance, and when he woke, he would provide interpretations and advice that the community generally accepted. The process of bringing problems to Tarn served multiple functions. Obviously, people hoped for practical solutions or spiritual intercession. But the act of consultation itself provided psychological relief, simply articulating a problem to someone else. Someone whose role was to listen and respond helped people organize their thoughts and emotions. The ritual of consultation, approaching Tarn's alcove, making the appropriate gestures of respect, formally stating the problem, created structure around chaos, made the overwhelming feel manageable. Tarn's responses weren't always immediately helpful. Sometimes his visions were cryptic, requiring interpretation. Sometimes they seemed unrelated to the problem at hand. But even ambiguous guidance was better than no guidance at all. If someone came to him worried about an upcoming hunt, and Tarn reported a vision of a white deer fleeing toward the sunrise, the hunters could decide that meant they should search eastward, should look for unusual markings on animals, should be especially alert and careful. Whether the vision contained genuine supernatural knowledge was less important than the fact that it gave the hunters a framework, a plan, a sense of purpose and direction. Was he genuinely accessing supernatural knowledge? We can't answer that question, not definitively, but we can say that his advice probably worked, at least often enough to maintain his status. Perhaps the altered states allowed his unconscious mind to process complex social and environmental information in ways that conscious thought couldn't manage. Perhaps the visions provided metaphorical solutions that the community could translate into practical action. Or perhaps, and this is equally possible, the mere existence of a decision-maker, a person whose interpretations were accepted as authoritative, reduced paralyzing uncertainty, and allowed the group to act cohesively. The success rate didn't have to be perfect for Tarn to maintain his position. If his guidance led to successful outcomes half the time, or even less, that might be enough. Humans are remarkably good at remembering successes and forgetting or rationalizing failures. When Tarn's vision led hunters to game, everyone remembered and the story was retold. When his guidance failed to produce results, explanations emerged. The spirits were testing them. Someone in the group had violated a taboo. The ritual hadn't been performed correctly. These explanations preserved belief in Tarn's abilities, even when empirical outcomes didn't support them. There's also the possibility that Tarn's advice worked through self-fulfilling prophecy. If he declared that hunters would succeed in a particular direction, they went that way with confidence, and confidence improves performance. Anxious, uncertain hunters are less observant, less patient, less accurate with their weapons. Confident hunters notice more details, wait for optimal opportunities, throw their spears with better focus. So Tarn's visions, even if they contained no supernatural content, might still have improved outcomes simply by providing the psychological conditions for success. Around Tarn, certain objects accumulated, not possessions in our modern sense, but sacred things that belonged to his role rather than to him personally. Animal skulls, carefully cleaned and arranged, unusual stones with interesting colors or patterns, bundles of dried plants, antlers from impressive deer, bones carved with markings that might have been early writing or might have been purely symbolic. These objects were collected over years, sometimes over decades. Each had significance, each connected to specific visions or successful healings or important moments in the community's history. The skull of a bear might have come from an animal killed during a particularly difficult winter, a hunt that Tarn had blessed with elaborate rituals. An unusual stone might have been found by someone who brought it to Tarn after experiencing a powerful dream. The carved bones might have been created by Tarn himself during long winter nights, the markings encoding memories of visions, or serving as mnemonic devices for remembering complex rituals. Some objects had been passed down from previous shamans, carriers of continuity between generations. When an old shaman died, certain sacred objects would be transferred to the new one, along with explanations of their significance and instructions for their use. This transmission of objects was a way of passing down knowledge and authority, of maintaining tradition across time. The objects themselves became repositories of the community's spiritual history. These objects were stored in his sleeping area, surrounding him as he rested. They weren't decorative, they were tools of his practice, objects of power that helped him access the spiritual realms. When he slept among them, he was literally surrounded by the sacred, and this environment shaped his dreams and visions. The arrangement of objects around his sleeping space wasn't random. Each was positioned deliberately, creating a geography of meaning. The bear skull might be placed where Tarn would see it first upon waking, reminding him of his connection to bear power. The carved bones might be arranged in patterns that had symbolic significance, creating a kind of sacred diagram around his sleeping furs. The bundles of plants were positioned within easy reach, so Tarn could add them to the fire without fully waking, maintaining the atmosphere of sacred smoke throughout the night. This environment influenced Tarn's consciousness in subtle but important ways. The objects served as prompts for his unconscious mind, as anchors for his dreams. If he was seeking guidance about hunting, his sleeping mind would engage with the antlers and animal skulls around him, would weave these images into dreams that he would then interpret as spiritual guidance. The environment and his consciousness interacted, creating a feedback loop where the physical space shaped mental experience, which in turn influenced how he interpreted and used the space. The furs he slept on were more numerous than those available to ordinary members of the tribe, not because he demanded luxury, but because the furs served his work. Certain animals had stronger spiritual associations than others. Bear furs in particular were prized. Bears were seen as powerful spirits, creatures that disappeared into caves in winter and emerged in spring seemingly reborn. To sleep on a bear fur was to connect with that power, to participate in that cycle of death and renewal. The significance of bear fur wasn't arbitrary. Bears genuinely did seem magical to these ancient people. Here was an animal that entered caves in autumn, seemingly died, sleeping so deeply that its breathing became almost imperceptible, its body temperature dropping to near-death levels, and then emerged in spring, often with cubs, as if reborn. This cycle must have seemed like a demonstration of transcendent power, proof that death could be overcome, that life could be renewed after apparent ending. For Tarn to sleep on bear fur was to ally himself with that power, to symbolically participate in the bear's journey through death and rebirth. Each night, as he entered his deep trances and altered states, he was metaphorically dying and being reborn like the bear. The fur wasn't just insulation against cold, it was a spiritual technology, a way of connecting his own consciousness to the archetypal power of the bear. Other furs had their own significances. Wolf fur might convey cunning and pack loyalty. Deer fur might connect to the spirits of the hunt. Each animal carried meanings and associations, and sleeping on their furs was a way of incorporating those qualities, of making them part of Tarn's spiritual arsenal. Tarn's sleep was also less interrupted by practical concerns. He didn't need to wake to gather water or check on children or perform the mundane tasks of survival. Others handled those things, ensuring that his rest could be focused entirely on the spiritual work the community needed him to perform. This division of labor was accepted because everyone benefited. The community received guidance and meaning, and in exchange they supported the person who provided those essential but intangible services. This freedom from practical duties was both privilege and burden. Yes, Tarn didn't have to worry about daily survival tasks, but he also carried the weight of being the community's primary source of spiritual guidance and meaning. When things went wrong, when his visions failed to provide helpful guidance, when rituals didn't produce expected results, the responsibility fell on him. He couldn't simply shrug and say he didn't know. His entire role depended on being the person who did know, who could access knowledge ordinary people couldn't reach. The community's provision for Tarn's needs wasn't automatic or unconditional. It depended on his continued effectiveness. If he lost his ability to enter trances, if his visions stopped coming, if his guidance repeatedly failed to help, the community would gradually withdraw support. He would be expected to resume normal labor, to hunt and gather like everyone else. His special status would evaporate. This threat was rarely explicit, but Tarn must have felt it constantly, must have understood that his comfort and privilege were conditional, dependent on maintaining the community's faith in his abilities. But let us not imagine Tarn as living in ease and comfort. His position carried burdens that others didn't bear. When things went wrong, when someone died despite his healing rituals, when the hunting failed despite his propitious readings of omens, he felt the weight of failure. The community might question whether his power was weakening, whether the spirits had abandoned him. His status was secure only as long as he delivered results, and results in that precarious time were never guaranteed. The psychological burden of this responsibility would have been immense. Every illness in the community became, in some sense, a test of Tarn's abilities. Every failed hunt raised questions about whether he had performed the rituals correctly, whether he had properly interpreted the omens. When a child died, Tarn had to provide explanation and meaning, had to help the grieving family accept their loss, all while possibly wondering whether he could have done something differently, whether his rituals had been inadequate. This burden would have followed him into sleep, would have shaped his dreams in anxiety-ridden ways. He might dream of failing the community, of being exposed as powerless, of the spirits withdrawing their favor. He might wake in the night, sweating and terrified, uncertain whether a particular dream was a genuine spiritual warning or merely the expression of his own fears and insecurities. The line between vision and anxiety would often be unclear. His sleep, for all its separateness and careful cultivation, was probably not entirely restful. The responsibility of being the intermediary between worlds, the pressure of providing answers when none might exist, the constant need to interpret and explain and guide, all of this would follow him into sleep, would shape his dreams in ways that weren't always pleasant. The visions he sought could become demanding, could feel more like hauntings than blessings. There are accounts from shamanic traditions worldwide of practitioners who came to dread their visions, who experienced them as invasive and overwhelming rather than enlightening. The spirits, once welcomed, could become demanding presences that disrupted sleep and peace. Tarn might have experienced this. Nights when the visions came unbidden and unwelcome, when the sacred smoke seemed to open doors he'd rather have kept closed, when the painted animals on the walls watched him with eyes that felt malevolent rather than protective. The cultivation of altered consciousness, the constant movement between waking and dreaming, the deliberate disruption of normal mental boundaries, all of this could damage psychological stability over time. Tarn might have suffered what we would now recognize as dissociative symptoms or paranoia or depression. The community would have interpreted these as signs of powerful spiritual activity, proof of Tarn's deep connection to the spirit world, but Tarn himself might have experienced them as torment, as the price demanded by his role. There were others in the community who enjoyed slightly elevated status, though not to Tarn's degree. The most skilled hunters, the men whose understanding of animal behavior and whose accuracy with spear or atlatl ensured regular kills in summer. The women whose gathering skills identified the best foraging sites, who could read the landscape and know where to find roots and nuts and berries. The craftspeople whose ability to shape flint into perfect blades or to create watertight containers from bark made everyone's life easier. These individuals had earned their status through demonstrated skill and consistent contribution. A skilled hunter didn't just occasionally succeed, he succeeded more often than others, understood animal behavior more deeply, could track prey through difficult terrain, could make the perfect throw even under challenging conditions. His skills were visible, measurable, undeniable. Similarly, a skilled gatherer consistently returned with more food, with better quality plants, with foods that others overlooked. A skilled toolmaker produced implements that lasted longer, cut cleaner, made everyone's work easier. The community tracked these contributions mentally, maintained an informal accounting of who provided what. This wasn't coldly transactional. People didn't calculate exact debts and credits. But over time, patterns emerged. Certain individuals consistently contributed more than others, and this created a sense of obligation, a feeling that these high performers deserved recognition and reward for their efforts. These individuals didn't sleep separately or maintain private fires, but they received subtle acknowledgments of their value. Slightly more food during shortages, more respect in group discussions, better materials for their personal use, the finest furs, the best-shaped tools, the choicest pieces from successful hunts. The distribution of food during shortages revealed status hierarchies most clearly. When times were good, when hunting was successful and plants were abundant, everyone ate well, and differences in status mattered less. But during winter, when stored food dwindled and fresh food was scarce, decisions had to be made about who received what portions. These decisions were never formalized into rules, but patterns emerged nonetheless. The most valuable individuals received slightly larger portions, not dramatically more, but enough to make a difference over time. A skilled hunter might receive an extra handful of dried berries, might get a piece of meat with slightly more fat, might have his bowl filled just a little fuller than others. These differences accumulated over weeks and months, maintaining the strength and capability of the people the community most depended on. Women who were nursing infants received priority, as did pregnant women, because the community's future depended on children surviving. The elderly received adequate portions because their knowledge was too valuable to lose. Skilled craftspeople, hunters, and gatherers received enough to maintain their capabilities. Those with less obvious value, the young adults not yet proven, the individuals with fewer skills, those who contributed less, they made do with smaller portions, and their health and strength declined accordingly. And their sleep, while still communal, was slightly less troubled by discomfort. They slept in good positions, not at the cold edges but among the warmer middle ranks. Their children were watched over more carefully by others, giving them longer stretches of uninterrupted rest. They could afford to sleep more deeply, knowing that the community valued them enough to ensure their well-being. The sleeping arrangements revealed status in miniature. At the very center, closest to the main fire, slept the elders and the most valuable individuals. Moving outward in concentric circles, status gradually declined until, at the cold outer edges where draft and chill were most severe, the lowest status individuals slept. The orphans, the individuals with disabilities that prevented full contribution, the people who had simply failed to develop valuable skills, the adolescents not yet proven. This arrangement wasn't formalized or discussed explicitly. People simply took positions that the group consensus accepted. If someone of low status attempted to claim a warm central position, they would find themselves subtly moved outward by the pressure of bodies, by suggestions that they should make room for others, by the uncomfortable feeling of transgressing unspoken rules. Similarly, if a high-status individual modestly tried to sleep at the edges, others would insist they move inward, would make space for them, would express concern about their well-being if they didn't take the comfort they had earned. Children absorbed these lessons implicitly. They learned by observation that some people mattered more than others, that value was demonstrated through contribution, that status brought comfort, and comfort brought survival advantage. These lessons shaped their ambitions and behaviors, motivated them to develop valuable skills, to prove themselves worthy of recognition and the privileges that came with it. The development of these hierarchies, these gradations of warmth and comfort and rest, marked something significant in human development. It was the beginning of social complexity, the first step toward the elaborate status systems that would eventually characterize civilizations. But it was still gentle, still minimal compared to what would come later. The differences were measured in feet of distance from the fire, in layers of fur, in slightly more food, not in palaces and peasants, not in massive inequalities of wealth and power. Yet even these small differences mattered profoundly. To sleep a few degrees warmer could mean the difference between waking refreshed or waking exhausted. To have slightly more food could mean maintaining enough energy to function well, rather than sliding into the lethargy of semi-starvation. The inequalities were small, but they compounded over time, and they shaped who survived winter and who didn't. The cumulative effects of these small advantages are easy to underestimate. A person who sleeps slightly warmer night after night maintains better immune function, fights off infections more effectively, heals from minor injuries more quickly. A person with slightly more food maintains better muscle mass, has more energy for daily tasks, thinks more clearly, and makes better decisions. Over weeks and months, these small differences create diverging trajectories of health and capability. Consider two individuals of similar age and natural ability. One sleeps in the warm center, receives adequate food, enjoys the respect and support of the community. The other sleeps at the cold edges, makes do with smaller portions, receives less attention and care. After one winter, the differences might be subtle. One looks slightly healthier, slightly more vigorous. After 5 winters, the differences become pronounced. After 10 winters, the difference might be the difference between life and death, between surviving into middle age or succumbing to illness or injury that a stronger person would have overcome. These effects weren't limited to the individuals themselves. They extended across generations, creating patterns of advantage and disadvantage that persisted through time. The children of high-status individuals inherited not just their parents' position, but the physical and cognitive benefits that came from better nutrition and rest during their own crucial developmental years. Children born to higher-status individuals had advantages. They nursed longer because their mothers had more nutrition to sustain milk production. They learned skills earlier because their parents had time and energy to teach them. They received better care when ill because resources weren't stretched quite so desperately thin. These children were more likely to survive to adulthood, more likely to thrive, and they carried forward the status of their parents. The nursing period was particularly crucial. A well-nourished mother could nurse her child for 2 or 3 years, providing not just calories, but antibodies and nutrients essential for development. A malnourished mother might have her milk dry up after 6 months or a year, forcing the child onto a diet of mashed foods that didn't provide optimal nutrition. The children who nursed longer, grew stronger, developed better immune systems, suffered fewer serious illnesses during the vulnerable early years. The teaching of skills also created intergenerational advantage. A high-status hunter had the energy and time to take his sons hunting, to teach them patiently how to track animals, how to predict their movements, how to throw a spear accurately. A low-status father, exhausted from marginal survival and lacking valuable skills to teach, might have little to pass on to his children. The high-status father's sons would develop superior hunting skills, would become valuable hunters themselves, would claim positions similar to their fathers. The low-status father's sons would remain unskilled, would struggle to contribute meaningfully, would perpetuate their father's low position. Care during illness demonstrated the effects of status most starkly. When a high-status child fell ill, the community mobilized resources. Tarn might perform healing rituals. The elders might recommend medicinal plants. The child would receive extra food to maintain strength, would sleep in the warmest position, would be watched constantly. Most importantly, the child's survival would feel important to the community, worth investing scarce resources to preserve. A low-status child received less intervention. The community's resources were limited, and investments were made where returns seemed most likely. If this child died, it was sad but not catastrophic. Another child could be born, but a high-status child represented invested value, carried forward important lineages, justified whatever resources were needed to preserve its life. This wasn't a rigid system. Status could be lost if skills deteriorated or if someone else proved more capable. A hunter who lost his accuracy, a craftsperson whose hands grew too arthritic to work precisely, would gradually lose status and the small privileges that came with it. Conversely, a young person who showed exceptional ability could rise, could claim a position closer to the fire through demonstrated value. The fluidity of the system was important. It meant that status had to be continuously earned, couldn't be completely coasted on indefinitely. The elderly retained status because of accumulated knowledge, but if an elder became senile or mentally incapacitated, unable to access or share that knowledge, their position would erode. They would still receive care. The community wasn't cruel, but they would slide gradually toward the outer circles, making room at the center for those who could actively contribute. Young people had opportunities to prove themselves and rise in status. An adolescent boy who showed unusual talent for hunting, who brought down his first large animal, who demonstrated wisdom beyond his years in tracking and stalking, could begin earning status even before full adulthood. An adolescent girl who showed extraordinary knowledge of plants, who could identify useful species others missed, who had the stamina and observational skills of the best gatherers, could similarly earn recognition and incremental privilege. But mobility went both ways. An adult who had once held status could lose it through injury, illness, or simply failing to maintain skills as others improved. A hunter who suffered an arm injury that reduced his throwing accuracy would find himself gradually migrating outward from the fire's center. A gatherer whose eyesight failed and who could no longer identify plants reliably would receive less food, less warm sleeping space, as her contribution diminished. The system was neither purely meritocratic nor purely hereditary. It was a constantly negotiated arrangement based on perceived current value to the community. But the system existed, subtle and unspoken but real. And at the top of this gentle hierarchy, individuals like Tarn slept in their separate spaces, tended their private fires, and dreamed their significant dreams while the rest of the community clustered together in the main chamber, sharing warmth and breath and the democratic discomfort of common survival. The contrast between Tarn's isolated sleep and the communal sleep of others captured something essential about the nature of status and specialization. Tarn had privilege, yes, but he also had profound isolation. He couldn't fully participate in the ordinary human intimacy of sleeping pressed together with others, of sharing breath and warmth and unconscious comfort. His separation was both elevation and alienation. He was special, but that specialness came at the cost of normal human connection. The community members sleeping together in the main chamber had less comfort, but more belonging. They were cold, yes, but they were cold together. They were hungry, but they shared that hunger. Their suffering was communal, which made it more bearable than isolated suffering would have been. They had each other, the warmth of other bodies, the reassurance of breathing in unison, the knowledge that they weren't facing the night's dangers alone. Tarn faced his nights alone. His visions, his trances, his communion with spirits, all of it happened in isolation. He woke in the darkness with only his sacred objects for company. He breathed his psychoactive smoke alone. His dreams, however significant, were experienced without the comfort of other sleeping bodies nearby. This was the price of his special status, not just the burden of responsibility, but the fundamental loneliness of being set apart from ordinary human fellowship. As winter progressed, these differences became more pronounced. Resources dwindled for everyone, but they dwindled unevenly. The sacred fires, the ones used for ritual and vision, were maintained even when the communal fire was reduced to conserve wood. Tarn's portions of food remained relatively consistent because the community believed his spiritual work required sustenance to be effective. The practical result was that while everyone lost weight and energy through the winter, some lost more than others. The progression of winter hunger followed predictable patterns. Early winter, when stored foods were still relatively abundant, everyone ate adequately, if not luxuriously. Midwinter, as stores depleted, portions began to shrink. Late winter, as spring remained distant and supplies ran critically low, hunger became the dominant reality for everyone except the most protected individuals. During this late winter period, the community's hierarchy became most visible and most consequential. The difference between adequate nutrition and near starvation could be measured in a few handfuls of food per day, but those handfuls determined whether someone maintained functional strength or descended into lethargy and vulnerability. The high-status individuals, including Tarn, remained functional. They could still perform their specialized roles. They could still think clearly, still move with reasonable energy, still contribute meaningfully to community survival. Lower-status individuals experienced progressive debilitation. They became weak, lethargic, unable to concentrate. They slept more because their bodies were shutting down non-essential functions to conserve energy. They moved slowly when awake because movement consumed precious calories. They became more susceptible to illness because their immune systems were compromised. Some died, the old who had outlived their knowledge, the young who hadn't yet proven valuable, the individuals who had never developed skills the community deemed essential. The elders, too, were protected as much as possible. Their knowledge was too valuable to risk losing, so they received care that younger, more replaceable individuals didn't. This wasn't cynical calculation, but practical wisdom born from countless winters. Lose a young hunter, and another could develop those skills eventually. Lose an elder who remembered which plants cured which ailments, who knew the stories that encoded survival information, who understood the movements of herds across decades. That loss couldn't be replaced. The community understood intuitively that knowledge took decades to accumulate but could be lost in moments. An elder who died took with them their entire lifetime of observation and learning. The stories they knew, the subtle environmental cues they could read, the accumulated wisdom they could share, all of it vanished when they died. Keeping elders alive wasn't sentimentality, it was practical necessity. Every winter that an elder survived meant another year of knowledge preserved, another cycle of teaching passed to the next generation. So the elders slept closest to the fire, wrapped in the best furs, and the community accepted this arrangement without resentment because they understood its logic. The elders had earned their comfort through years of contribution, and they would continue to contribute knowledge as long as they lived. The acceptance of this arrangement reveals something important about the community's values. They understood that contribution took many forms. The young hunter who brought back meat was contributing obviously and immediately. The elder who no longer hunted but who could identify which direction a herd had moved based on subtle signs, who could predict weather patterns, who could remember what the community had done to survive past catastrophes, that elder was also contributing, even if the contribution was less immediately visible. The community maintained this broader understanding of value because survival required more than just immediate physical labor. It required accumulated wisdom, required institutional memory, required the kind of deep knowledge that only came from decades of experience. The elders embodied this knowledge, and protecting them was protecting the community's collective memory and wisdom. There's something both beautiful and troubling about this system. Beautiful because it shows that even in the harshest conditions, humans found ways to honor and protect those who contributed meaning and knowledge to community life. Troubling because it reminds us that inequality isn't merely a feature of complex civilizations, but is woven into human social life at the most basic levels. The beauty lies in the reciprocity. High-status individuals received privileges, yes, but those privileges came with responsibilities. Tarn had to provide spiritual guidance. Elders had to share knowledge. Skilled hunters had to hunt successfully. Skilled gatherers had to gather abundantly. The relationship was transactional but not exploitative. Everyone contributed according to their abilities and received according to their contributions. The system wasn't perfectly fair, but it maintained a basic logic that most community members could accept. The troubling aspect is that this system created and perpetuated inequality even when resources were scarce and survival was precarious for everyone. It would be easier to imagine that scarcity produces equality, that when everyone is suffering, differences dissolve. But human societies don't work that way. Even, perhaps especially, during scarcity, humans create hierarchies, allocate resources unequally, and privilege some lives over others. Yet we should be careful not to judge too harshly. The inequalities of that time were tiny compared to what came later. No one lived in wealth while others starved. No one commanded others absolutely or claimed divine right to rule. The differences were measured in degrees of warmth, in small increments of comfort, in the relative peace of one's sleep. Everyone still suffered. Some just suffered slightly less. The distance between the highest and lowest status individuals could be traversed in a few steps. Tarn, sleeping in his alcove, was still in the same cave as everyone else, still facing the same winter, still dependent on the same firekeeping and food storing and collective survival strategies. His privileges elevated him, but didn't separate him completely. He remained fundamentally part of the community, sharing its fate even if he experienced that fate slightly more comfortably than others. Compare this to later civilizations where kings lived in palaces while peasants starved, where the wealthy enjoyed luxuries beyond imagination while the poor died of preventable diseases, where social distance became so vast that the privileged could forget entirely that the suffering existed. The Ice Age communities never reached such extremes. Their hierarchies were gentle, their inequalities minimal, their status systems still embedded in fundamental interdependence. And perhaps that's the deeper lesson here, that hierarchy and inequality emerge naturally from human social life, but their expression can be gentle or harsh, minimal or extreme. The cave dwellers of the Ice Age created status systems, yes, but those systems didn't prevent the majority from surviving. The distance between the warmest sleeper and the coldest was real but traversable. Everyone could see the fire, could feel its warmth to some degree, could participate in the collective survival, even if their participation was valued slightly differently. The cave itself enforced a kind of equality by limiting how extreme differences could become. There was only so much fire, only so much food, only so much space. Tarn couldn't accumulate vast wealth or build a separate palace. The best he could do was claim a small alcove and maintain a modest private fire. The elders couldn't hoard resources beyond what they could physically control. The skilled hunters couldn't translate their abilities into permanent, inheritable privilege that would persist regardless of continued contribution. The physical constraints of cave living meant that inequality could only develop so far before it became unsustainable. If Tarn demanded too much food, others would starve and the community would collapse, taking Tarn with it. If the elders consumed too many resources, the young would die and there would be no next generation to preserve. The system had built-in limits that prevented inequality from becoming catastrophic. As we think about these ancient sleepers now, as we imagine Tarn in his alcove, breathing juniper smoke and seeking visions while the rest of the tribe huddled together in the main chamber, we might reflect on our own hierarchies of rest, how we too sleep unequally, some in warm, comfortable beds in climate-controlled rooms, others in precarious situations with inadequate shelter and heat. Some able to rest deeply without worry, others kept awake by anxiety about survival, about whether they'll have food tomorrow, shelter next month, safety next year. The parallels between then and now are uncomfortable but real. We still have hierarchies of warmth and comfort. We still have individuals who sleep soundly in security, while others shiver in precarious circumstances. We still allocate rest unequally based on perceived value and status. The mechanisms have changed. We use money and property rights rather than proximity to fire, but the fundamental pattern persists. The fire in our time is not literal but metaphorical. It's access to resources, to security, to the conditions that make restful sleep possible. And like the ancient fire, it's distributed unequally, with some sleeping in its warm center, while others shiver at the cold edges, hoping the warmth will eventually reach them. Our modern inequalities are vastly greater than anything those ancient communities experienced. The distance between the wealthiest and poorest in our societies is measured not in feet from a fire, but in orders of magnitude of resources and security. Some people sleep in climate-controlled mansions with every comfort money can buy, while others sleep on streets or in shelters, exposed to cold and danger and uncertainty. Some people can sleep peacefully, knowing they have resources to weather any crisis, while others lie awake, terrified about how they'll survive the next day. The physical constraints that limited inequality in ancient caves no longer apply. Modern economies can accumulate and concentrate wealth to degrees those ancient people couldn't imagine. Status can become hereditary across generations, creating permanent classes of privilege and deprivation. The rich and poor live in such different worlds that they might never encounter each other, never confront the reality of their mutual existence. But there's also something to learn from how those ancient communities handled their inequalities. The high-status individuals didn't simply take, they gave. Tarn provided spiritual guidance and interpretation. The elders shared knowledge. The skilled hunters and gatherers taught others their crafts. The relationship was reciprocal. Status brought comfort, yes, but it also brought responsibility to contribute to the community's well-being. This reciprocity was enforced not by formal rules but by the fundamental interdependence of the community. Tarn depended on hunters for food. Hunters depended on Tarn for spiritual confidence. Elders depended on the young for physical labor. The young depended on elders for knowledge. No one could survive alone, so everyone had to maintain relationships of mutual obligation and support. Modern societies have lost much of this enforced reciprocity. The wealthy can isolate themselves from the poor, can use their resources to insulate themselves from the consequences of inequality. They don't depend on specific individuals in the way Tarn depended on specific hunters. They can buy whatever they need from abstract markets, can hire help without forming meaningful relationships, can live entirely separate from those who produce their comfort and security. And when winter was truly desperate, when starvation threatened everyone, the hierarchies softened. Tarn's visions couldn't create food where none existed. The elders' knowledge couldn't stop the cold. In those moments of ultimate crisis, status meant less. Everyone was reduced to the same basic struggle, everyone equally vulnerable to winter's indifference. These moments of leveling crisis were important. They reminded everyone, high and low status alike, that they shared a common humanity, a common vulnerability. Tarn might sleep warmer most nights, but when food ran out completely, he starved like everyone else. The elders might receive better care, but when deep cold penetrated the cave, they shivered too. These reminders prevented status from hardening into something absolute, maintained awareness that all humans face the same fundamental fragility. The community emerged from these crisis moments with renewed understanding of their interdependence. Having faced extreme scarcity together, having seen that no amount of status could protect against nature's worst extremes, they maintained a basic solidarity that transcended their hierarchies. They were all survivors together, all members of the same small group trying to persist through impossible conditions. Perhaps this is what prevented the hierarchies from hardening into oppression, the regular reminder arriving with each winter that all humans are fundamentally fragile, that comfort and status are conditional, dependent on factors beyond anyone's control, that we're all, in the end, small creatures huddled against the cold, hoping to survive until spring. This understanding has been largely lost in modern societies. The wealthy can go their entire lives without experiencing genuine deprivation, without confronting their own fundamental vulnerability. They can build walls, literal and metaphorical, that protect them from ever feeling the cold that others experience constantly. They can forget that they share a common humanity with those who suffer, can imagine that their comfort is earned and permanent and secure rather than conditional and contingent. The ancient cave dwellers couldn't forget. Winter reminded them every year. Scarcity confronted them regularly. They saw clearly that all human life was fragile, that the distance between comfort and catastrophe was small, that everyone depended on everyone else for survival. This awareness shaped their hierarchies, kept their inequalities from becoming absolute, maintained a basic recognition of shared fate. As night deepens now in our imagined cave, as the fires, both communal and separate, burn steadily in the darkness, we can picture the whole community in their various states of rest. Tarn in his alcove, surrounded by sacred objects, breathing sacred smoke, his consciousness moving through visionary landscapes. The elders, close to the main fire, sleeping peacefully after lifetimes of surviving just this situation. The skilled hunters and gatherers in comfortable middle positions. And at the edges, the young, the ordinary, those without special status, pressed together for warmth, sharing breath and dreams, surviving through solidarity rather than privilege. All of them sleeping, all of them dreaming, all of them waiting for spring. The differences in their comfort were real, but relative. All of them were cold, some were just less cold. All of them were hungry, some were just less hungry. All of them were human, facing the same ancient enemy, winter's darkness and cold, with the same ancient strategies: fire, shelter, community, and sleep. The cave held them all in its stony embrace, indifferent to their individual status. The rock didn't care whether Tarn was special or ordinary. The winter outside didn't distinguish between elder and youth. The darkness fell equally on everyone. And in the morning, when light began to filter into the cave again, everyone would wake, some more rested than others, some warmer than others, but all alive, all having survived another night. And in the morning, when the fires were tended and the day's small activities began, they would emerge from their various sleeping spaces and come together again as a group. The hierarchies would reassert themselves in subtle ways, but the fundamental interdependence would remain clear. Tarn needed the hunters to bring meat. The hunters needed Tarn's rituals for psychological confidence. The elders needed the young to gather wood and water. The young needed the elders' knowledge to survive future winters. Everyone needed everyone, and that need was the bedrock beneath whatever status differences existed. The morning routine revealed this interdependence clearly. Tarn might emerge from his alcove expecting food to be provided, but someone had to hunt or gather that food. The elders might wake expecting assistance, but someone had to be willing and able to provide it. The skilled hunters might expect respect and good sleeping positions, but they had to continue hunting successfully to maintain that status. Every day required demonstration of value, required contribution, required maintenance of the relationships that made status meaningful. This daily renewal of interdependence kept the system functioning. Status wasn't assumed but confirmed through continued contribution. Privileges weren't taken for granted but earned repeatedly through demonstrated value. The reciprocity that characterized the system wasn't just historical or traditional. It was practiced daily, enacted in countless small interactions that reinforced everyone's understanding of their place in the community and their obligations to others. This is perhaps the most important insight from examining how power slept differently in those ancient times. That even when hierarchies existed, even when some slept warmer than others, the underlying reality of shared vulnerability kept those hierarchies from becoming absolute. The cold didn't respect status. Hunger didn't acknowledge privilege. Winter threatened everyone equally, and survival required cooperation that transcended individual advantage. The lesson isn't that hierarchy is good or that inequality is natural in some way that makes it acceptable. Rather, the lesson is that hierarchy emerges from human social organization, but its character depends on context. In small communities where everyone depends on everyone else, where the powerful face the same ultimate threats as the powerless, hierarchies remain relatively gentle. They're based on contribution and maintained through reciprocity. They can be lost as well as gained. They don't prevent the majority from surviving. It's only when societies become large enough and wealthy enough that the powerful can insulate themselves from shared vulnerability that hierarchies harden into oppression. When the elite never face scarcity, never confront their own fragility, never depend directly on those they rule, that's when inequality becomes catastrophic. That's when the distance between high and low status becomes measured not in feet from a fire, but in unbridgeable gulfs of experience and security. As we drift now toward our own rest, in our own time, with our own hierarchies and inequalities, we might carry this image with us. The cave, the fires, the sleeping people in their various distances from warmth. We might reflect on where we sleep in this arrangement, closer to the warmth or further from it, and what that means. We might consider whether our own status systems retain that ancient wisdom of reciprocity, that understanding that we're all fundamentally vulnerable and interdependent, and we might ask ourselves whether we're moving toward greater inequality or whether we're maintaining, as those ancient communities did, a basic acknowledgement of shared humanity beneath whatever differences exist. These are important questions for our time. As inequality grows, as the distance between rich and poor increases, as the wealthy build ever higher walls between themselves and those who suffer, we risk losing the ancient wisdom that those cave dwellers understood instinctively. We risk creating societies where the privileged forget that they share a common fate with the rest of humanity, where hierarchies harden into permanent systems that privilege some while condemning others to suffering and early death. The ancient model wasn't perfect. Hierarchy and inequality are never fully just, but it maintained something valuable, the recognition that we're all in this together, that survival requires cooperation, that today's privileged person might be tomorrow's vulnerable one if circumstances change. It maintained the reciprocity that makes hierarchy bearable and the reminders of shared vulnerability that prevent inequality from becoming absolute. But these are thoughts for waking hours, for conscious reflection. For now, as sleep approaches, let these images simply wash over you. The fire burning steadily, the people resting in their places, each finding whatever peace they can in the darkness. The cave holding them all, elite and common alike, in its stony embrace. The winter outside, vast and indifferent, while inside, human warmth, both literal and metaphorical, persists against the cold. Let the image settle, the community at rest, hierarchical but unified, unequal but interdependent, differentiated but fundamentally facing the same ancient challenge of surviving winter's darkness. Let it remind us that how we arrange ourselves for sleep, how we distribute comfort and security, how we value different contributions and different lives, these aren't just practical matters but moral ones, reflecting our deepest beliefs about what it means to be human, to live in community, to face together the challenges that threaten us all. And as your own eyes grow heavy, as your own breathing slows towards sleep, imagine yourself in that ancient cave, finding your place among the sleepers, adding your breath to the collective rhythm of humans resting together through the long night, waiting for spring. And so we arrive, gently, at the end of our journey through winter's long hold on the ancient world. We've traveled far together, back 40,000 years, into the darkness of caves, into the lives of people whose names we'll never know but whose struggles and triumphs shaped everything that came after. We've felt the cold they felt, imagined the hunger they endured, and witnessed the remarkable ways they found to survive, and even, in their own way, to thrive. Think now about the distance we've covered, not in miles, but in time and consciousness. We began in a world unimaginably different from our own, a world without cities or agriculture, without writing or wheels, without any of the technologies we consider essential to human life. A world where survival meant constant attention, constant adaptation, constant cooperation. Where winter wasn't merely inconvenient but life-threatening. Where sleep wasn't a luxury scheduled between obligations but a fundamental survival strategy woven into the very fabric of existence. We walked through the daily life of those early people, felt the bite of morning cold, watched the endless repetition of tasks designed not to achieve but simply to endure. We gathered ice for water, tended fires that could never be allowed to die, rationed food that was never quite enough, and settled each night into the communal warmth of bodies pressed together against the darkness. We learned that their lives, for all their hardship, weren't without peace. That acceptance of what couldn't be changed brought its own kind of rest, deeper perhaps than the anxious comfort we know today. We met Kora, that woman of 35,000 years ago, and through her eyes we saw winter not as abstract historical fact, but as lived experience. We felt her maternal love for her daughter, her quiet grief for the son she lost, her skilled hands working with bone needle and hide. We experienced her hunger, her exhaustion, her dreams that mixed memory and vision into something that felt more true than waking life. And we witnessed her survival, not through heroics or exceptional circumstances, but through the simple, profound act of endurance. She woke each morning, tended the fire, ate what little there was, worked when she had energy, and slept when consciousness became too heavy to maintain. Then we drifted into deeper mystery, exploring the possibility that our ancestors did more than simply sleep through winter's darkness, that they may have entered states approaching hibernation, metabolic slowdowns that allowed them to survive months with minimal food and activity. We examined the evidence, bones showing seasonal stress patterns, caves arranged like hibernation chambers, art suggesting altered consciousness and dream states. We considered genetic remnants of torpor genes, cultural practices of extreme winter rest, and the biological possibility that humans once had capabilities we've since lost or suppressed. Whether true hibernation or simply profound rest, the conclusion remains the same. Our ancestors knew how to surrender to winter in ways we've forgotten. They didn't fight the darkness but moved into it, trusting their body's wisdom, trusting the fire they tended, trusting each other and the rhythms of nature that promised spring would eventually return. Finally, we explored the subtle hierarchies within those ancient communities, the ways that status manifested even in the most egalitarian groups. We met Tarn the shaman, sleeping in his separate space with his sacred fires and vision-inducing smoke. We saw the elders close to the warmth, the skilled craftspeople in comfortable positions, and the ordinary people at the edges, all arranged in a gentle hierarchy of warmth and rest. But we also saw that these differences, while real, remained modest, that shared vulnerability kept inequalities from hardening into oppression, that winter threatened everyone regardless of status, and thus demanded cooperation that transcended individual advantage. What does all of this mean for us, here in our own time, in our own struggles with sleep and rest? Perhaps it means that we've lost something essential in our conquest of winter, in our determination to maintain summer's pace year-round. We live in perpetual artificial daylight, in climate-controlled environments that never ask us to adapt to seasonal changes. We expect ourselves to be equally productive in December and June, to sleep the same 8 hours regardless of whether nights are long or short, to maintain constant energy and focus despite the biological rhythms that still pulse quietly within us. And we suffer for it. We're tired in ways our ancestors might not have been, despite having infinitely more comfortable sleeping conditions. Because comfort and rest aren't the same thing. Rest requires surrender, acceptance, alignment with natural rhythms rather than resistance to them. Our ancestors slept well in caves, not because caves were comfortable, but because they accepted what winter demanded: slowness, stillness, the release of striving in favor of simple being. They understood, perhaps without articulating it, that life moves in cycles, that there are seasons for action and seasons for rest, times for gathering and times for preserving, periods of wakefulness and periods when consciousness should dim and dreams should take precedence. They didn't try to maintain constant productivity because they recognized that winter makes such efforts wasteful, even dangerous. Better to slow down, to sleep deeply, to conserve energy, and wait for the season when action becomes possible again. This wisdom feels almost revolutionary in our modern context, where rest is often seen as laziness, where sleep is something to be minimized rather than honored, where the ability to function on insufficient rest is bizarrely celebrated as strength. We've inverted the values that allowed our ancestors to survive. We fight our body's need for rest, medicate ourselves into alertness when we should be sleeping, shame ourselves for the natural slowdowns that winter brings. But your body remembers the ancient patterns even if your conscious mind has forgotten them. When winter comes and you feel that urge to slow down, to sleep longer, to withdraw slightly from constant social engagement, that's not dysfunction. That's your body trying to do what bodies have done for hundreds of thousands of years, trying to adapt to seasonal changes that your artificially lit, constantly heated environment pretends don't exist. So perhaps the real gift from our journey tonight isn't just a bedtime story or a historical curiosity. Perhaps it's permission to rest more deeply, to accept your need for sleep without guilt, to recognize that surrender isn't weakness, but wisdom. The cave dwellers of the Ice Age survived impossible conditions not by fighting constantly, but by knowing when to fight and when to rest. They made it through winter not by resisting sleep, but by embracing it, by letting consciousness dim when dimming was what survival required. As you lie here now in your own warm space, think about how far removed you are from those ancient sleepers, and also how fundamentally similar. You're wrapped in layers, as they were, though yours are likely cotton or synthetic rather than animal hide. You're warmed by controlled heat rather than fire, but the principle remains the same, creating a pocket of warmth in a cold world. You're horizontal, eyes closing, consciousness beginning to drift, just as countless humans have done through countless nights for hundreds of thousands of years. The specific circumstances have changed beyond recognition, but the act itself remains identical. Sleep is sleep, whether in a cave or a modern bedroom. The surrender is the same. The journey into unconsciousness, into dreams, into that mysterious space where the self dissolves and reforms. All of this links you directly to every human who has ever lived, including those Ice Age survivors who slept in darkness and woke to tend dying fires. And here's something beautiful to carry into sleep. Those ancient people, for all their struggles, may have slept better than we do. Not because their conditions were comfortable, they weren't, but because their sleep was untroubled by the particular anxieties of modern life. They didn't lie awake worrying about careers or finances in any way we'd recognize. They didn't stress about productivity or achievement. They didn't compare themselves to others in ways that created inadequacy and shame. Their anxieties were immediate and physical. Is there enough food? Will the fire last? Will we survive this winter? But these anxieties were also shared collectively and resolved through collective action. When the whole community faced the same challenges, individual stress was somehow lessened. And when night came and there was nothing more to be done, sleep arrived naturally, heavily, pulling consciousness down without resistance. This is perhaps the final lesson from our ancestors, that sleep comes most easily when we've accepted the day's limitations, when we've done what we could and acknowledged what we couldn't, when we've let go of the illusion of control and surrendered to forces larger than ourselves. The cave dwellers didn't choose winter, didn't control its duration or severity, couldn't make spring arrive faster through will or effort. They simply endured, and that acceptance, that deep recognition of their own smallness in the face of vast natural forces, brought a kind of peace. You can choose that peace now. You can set aside, just for this night, the modern anxieties that have nothing to do with immediate survival, the emails that need answering, the projects that need completing, the relationships that need tending. All of it can wait until morning. For these hours of darkness, you can be like those ancient sleepers, focused only on the immediate, the warmth surrounding you, the softness beneath you, the gentle rhythm of your own breathing. Imagine yourself back in that cave one final time. The fire burns steadily, its light playing across the stone walls. Around you, people are already deep in sleep, their breathing slow and synchronized. The cold presses at the cave entrance, but here, in this protected space, warmth holds. Outside, winter continues its slow passage, indifferent to human concerns, simply being what winter is. Inside, life persists quietly, patiently, waiting for the turn of seasons. You're wrapped in furs, your body heavy with the exhaustion of survival. Your mind has moved beyond anxiety into acceptance. There's nothing more to do tonight, nothing more to worry about, nothing more to solve. There's only this moment, this warmth, this darkness, and the slow pull of sleep becoming impossible to resist. Your eyes close, and even closed, the darkness behind them feels vast and welcoming. Your breathing slows, matching the rhythm of the sleepers around you, becoming part of that ancient symphony of human rest. Your body temperature drops slightly as sleep approaches, and this cooling feels natural, feels right, feels like something your body has done countless times before. The dreams will come soon, and they'll be whatever they are, sometimes strange, sometimes ordinary, sometimes vivid and memorable, sometimes forgotten the moment you wake. It doesn't matter. The dreams aren't something you control or direct. They're simply what consciousness does when released from the task of managing the waking world. Let them come, let them be, let them carry you deeper into rest. And if you wake during the night, as humans naturally do, don't fight it. Lie quiet in the darkness, as those cave dwellers did when they woke to tend the fire. Feel your breath. Feel your heartbeat. Acknowledge that you're alive, that you're safe, that morning will come when it comes. Then let sleep reclaim you, gently, easily, without resistance. You're carrying forward something ancient tonight. This simple act of lying down and releasing consciousness, this trust that sleep will restore you, this surrender to the body's needs. Every person who has ever lived has done this. Every ancestor whose genes you carry knew this experience intimately. You're part of an unbroken chain of sleepers stretching back through millennia, back to those caves and fires and long winters, back to the very beginning of human story. And that story continues through you, through this night, through this rest. Tomorrow you'll wake and rejoin the waking world with its demands and complications. But tonight, for these hours, you can be simply what you are, a breathing body, a dreaming consciousness, a small pocket of human warmth in the vast darkness, resting deeply because rest is what this moment requires. The fire burns low now, but it will last through the night. The cave holds steady, as it has for countless winters. The sleepers breathe together in the darkness, each in their own dreams, but somehow connected, somehow together, even in the privacy of unconsciousness. And you listening to this, feeling sleep approach like a rising tide, you're part of this too, part of the ancient pattern, part of the endless cycle of waking and sleeping, of surviving and resting, of enduring winter and waiting for spring. Let it come now. Let sleep arrive, let consciousness fade, let the last thoughts drift away like smoke rising from a dying fire. Let your breathing slow to the pace of deep rest. Let your body grow heavy, sinking into softness, surrendering completely to the pull of sleep. Winter is long, but sleep is deep. The darkness is vast, but dreams will light it from within. The cold continues outside, but you're warm here, safe here, held here, in this moment of perfect rest. Sleep now, ancient sleeper. Sleep now, child of the Ice Age. Sleep now, carrier of the old wisdom. Sleep deeply and peacefully, as your ancestors slept, as humans have always slept, when they surrendered to night's gentle demand. The fire will burn, the cave will hold, spring will come, but for now, just sleep.